Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Growing up, my wife Rhea's best friend in life was her brother Evan. Even with the age and gender difference, they were kindred spirits. Out of millions of genetic possibilities, somehow they were born with the same mental framework. He taught her how to ride a bike, stood up to bullies for her, even taught her how to throw her first punch when she said she was ready to handle things independently. Evan died when my wife was 15. Her family assumed the person driving was under the influence of alcohol. Not that they could be sure. Police said it was a classic hit and run. According to bits and pieces she's told me, their family all grieved in different ways. My mother-in-law turned to the bottle, while my supposed father-in-law turned to the comforts of other women. As for Rhea, she decided to get married and leave that hellhole town as soon as legally possible. That's just what she did. We first met when I was 17 years old. I was blowing off steam after work at the local pool hall. She looked my way and hasn't looked in any other direction since. We got married, moved far away, and soon after had our daughter Eva. Neither one of us had much experience with babies, but that little angel was made for us. She taught us how much love our hearts were capable of, while we taught her how to be the best little person that she could be. The years and milestones flew by. Before long, she had bloomed into a spunky 8-year-old kid. We had just bought a house, packed everything up, and moved 2 states away for better work opportunities. Eva was so young that there was a chance she wouldn't remember much, but we were still worried about how she had transitioned into a new home in a new state. We had weighed all the pros and cons for weeks beforehand and ultimately decided that moving was best for us. Things were business as usual until Eva came into the living room with big news one day. She bounced in, the knees of her khakis blackened with dirt. "Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad." She beamed through a smile riddled with discarded baby teeth. "What have you been doing out there, Boo Bear?" Rhea asked. "Your pants are filthy. You'll need a bath later on, don't forget." "Ugh, I just took one last night," Eva whined, pulling an orange autumn leaf from her wild hair. "I was outside planting flower seeds. I snuck some in the cart with Dad the other day at the hardware store." She interrupts me before I have time to speak. "The good news is I made a new friend today." That's nice," my wife said dismissively, her face once again buried in her phone. "Flower seeds? This time of year?" I interjected. "Oh, sweetheart, the last thing I want to do in life is hurt your feelings, but it's just the wrong time of year for that. Thanksgiving is almost here, and the ground will likely be frozen by then, my love." "Hey," Rhea snapped. "That's enough out of you, sir." She turned back to her phone, softening her tone while addressing our daughter. "Daddy is silly. They will grow when the ground thaws. Tell me about your new friend, sweetheart." "His name is Mr. Evans, and he's really, really nice. He showed me how to make the rows straight for our flowers to grow." Rhea's head shot up at hearing the new name. "Evans, you said?" Her eyes misted over briefly before she turned away and wiped at them. "What's wrong, Mama?" our little girl asked with mounting concern etched on her face. I decided to handle the question so my wife wouldn't have to. Mommy had an older brother named Evan, sweetheart. She just misses him is all. She'll be okay. Rhea straightens up once I say this, walking over and giving Eva a massive hug before leaving the room to make grilled cheese and tomato soup for our lunch. A week had gone by, and by that time Eva had talked about Mr. Evans quite a bit. She couldn't tell us how old he was, and she never left the front yard. After the 3rd time she mentioned him, I decided to watch her through the window during playtime. I never saw anyone else in the yard, just Eva, talking to herself and picking up rocks. After seeing that, I assumed Mr. Evans was an imaginary friend, conjured by our daughter to ease the pain of leaving her friends behind back home. My wife, however, wasn't so sure. Rhea rushed up to me, eyes alight with excitement. It's Evan. My brother's been watching over us this whole time. I looked at her incredulously as she paused to catch her breath. Eva was outside, singing a song that we made up as kids. When I asked her where she heard it, she said Mr. Evans told her to ask her mom. Grateful tears began streaming down her face. I didn't have the heart to tell her my opinion on the matter. We had been sleeping strictly back-to-back for weeks as it was. I hadn't seen her that happy since before the move. Still, though, I had to flirt with the issue. Honey, are you sure it's not just an imaginary friend she's made for herself? This Mr. Evans didn't show up until after we moved, after she was forced to adjust to new surroundings and a new life. My wife's eyes bulged in disbelief just before she whipped her head away as if slapped. After a few moments, she returned her gaze to me, cold as stone. Her jaw was clenched in bitter anger as the grit in her voice traveled through our living room. Why? You're asking why? What does it matter? He's here now. You think I'm crazy, don't you? Well, I'm telling you, there is no way she could have learned that song without someone teaching it to her. I raised my hands in defeat, not wanting to press it and further upset her. All right, Rhea, all right, I conceded. I'm sorry I doubted you. Just keep an eye out, okay? This whole thing makes me nervous. We should get some sleep. It's a big day tomorrow. Lots to do. The next afternoon, Rhea ran to our kitchen table, handing me a dirtied Polly Pocket figurine. I lost this the year that Evan died. Eva was playing with it by the garden. Tears glistened in her eyes as she smiled towards the ceiling. It's a sign. There's no denying it now. Just then, we were interrupted by happy squeals from the front yard. The front door banged against the wall behind it, making us both jump as our daughter burst into the kitchen. Mommy, Mr. Evans wants to come to dinner tonight. It is Thanksgiving after all. Can you set an extra plate? My wife giggled with astonishment and nodded eagerly. I gently grabbed her elbow, a terrible feeling in my gut. Rhea. The look she gave me stopped me cold in my tracks, the hatred in her eyes stealing the words from my tongue. We prepared dinner together that night. We stood side by side in the kitchen as a family, but no one spoke but Eva. You'd never be able to tell that my wife was mad by the way she flitted about the kitchen, preparing everything with extra care. There was a moment where we shared a laugh. Eva was shucking corn cobs unsuccessfully, continuously fumbling them as they slipped through her tiny hands. We almost reverted to our usual selves, but it was infinitesimally fleeting. Eva set the table for 4, just as expected. We sat down around a steaming roasted turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, rolls, and an array of vegetables. I reached out for a drumstick as Eva wailed in protest. No, Daddy. We have to say grace first. Dear God, thank you for our food, Kitty, Mommy, and Daddy. Oh, and Mr. Evans, too. And... Before she could finish her prayer, the doorbell rang. My wife and I froze in foreboding confusion as Eva rushed to the door. Ghosts can't ring doorbells, Rhea. I snapped at my wife. Horror shone in her eyes as she mumbled a lame response. Maybe it's someone else. I didn't bother to answer, only rushed towards the front door. God knows who could have met Eva at the other side of that door. I was too late, however. Moments later, to my horror, she appeared back in the dining room, holding the hand of a dirtied older man. We both stood up from the table, Rhea rushing over to Eva and grabbing her away from the strange man. I reached in the waistband of my pants, only to remember I had taken my gun and holster off when I had gotten home that evening. The man straightened up, brushed layers of filth off of his sleeves, and began to speak. Good evening, Tom, Rhea. My name is Charles Evans. He turned to Eva sharply. Honey, I'm going to need you to go on up to your room for a moment. I'll call you down when it's time for ice cream. He smiled at her through grimy teeth. Normally, I would never condone a strange person telling my child what to do, but at that moment, her room seemed like the safest option. I nodded my head towards her, and she skipped off to her room, humming an unknown melody. My wife sobbed into her dinner napkin, a myriad of negative emotions consuming her mind and spirit. You're not my Evan? Well, what do you want from us? She stammered through sobs. Don't be afraid, my dear, he cooed towards Rhea. I'm just an old friend, part of the family if you think about it a certain way. The man strode to my wife's side of the table, wiping away her tears with dirt-smudged hands. Don't worry, darling. You got to be one of the lucky ones. I left a whole life for you to live. I spent a lot of my life watching you and your brother when you were young. After he died and the town went into a frenzy for justice, I thought it was best to lay low for a while. He stooped over and slowly inhaled my wife's hair. You smell just like him. I made a mistake. I took him too young. But you see, you're older now. You've had more of a life to live, and now I'm ready to complete the set.
The elemental love of a man for his family will take queer turns at times, but for sheer horror, none of the famous tragedies of history can equal the warped affection which forms the basis of the incident I'm about to narrate. It happened in the heart of that vast uninhabited country drained by the Upper Congo, some 200 miles from civilization's nearest outpost. As a member of the Denkla geographic expedition, I'd spent nearly a year in the wild interior, collecting a mass of scientific data for the society we represented. While the task at hand had been a fascinating one, I could feel myself growing dull and sluggish, mentally as well as physically, under the devitalizing rays of the African sun. My notebook recalls the date as June 14th, 1890, when we emerged from the swamp-infested inland and again set eyes on the sullen waters of the dominating Congo. The sight was but a welcome one. To us it meant but a 5 days' journey to the comfort and contentment of a white man's home. We pitched our tents on the angle of land formed by a tiny rivulet and the growing expanse of the master stream. The sun had dipped far down behind the towering trees to the west by the time our camp chores were completed, and the comparative coolness of the early evening had sprung up. Wearied by the arduous tasks of the day, I indulged in a leisurely pipe and prepared to retire immediately. Upon entering my tent, I discovered, with wondering eyes, a long, gaping rent in the canvas opposite, clean cut and new. From outside there sounded the soft thud of flying feet. I plunged through the opening in time to see a dim figure disappear into the tangled undergrowth of the darkening jungle. Investigation developed that a rifle, several boxes of cartridges, and 2 scientific books, which we carried for reference, were missing. Apparently nothing else had been tampered with. A guard was mounted on the encampment that night, but the mysterious marauder never returned. Stretched out on my cot, I pondered over the puzzling occurrence for some time. That the theft had been perpetrated by a white man I knew. The form which had scurried into the leafy undercover of the jungle was not that of a dark-skinned native. This was a riddle in itself, for the men who penetrate any distance into the wilds of the world are men of purpose, who find no time for petty thievery. But the nature of the loot was as much of a wonder as the race of the man. Apparently no food had been sought. And why the books? Why the books? I could frame no satisfactory answer, and fell asleep presently, with that query weaving monotonously through my brain. High noon of our 3rd day in that locality had found me some distance inland on a little hunting excursion of my own. I'd about decided to retrace my steps back to camp when I brought up suddenly in astonishment that the section of the dark continent should harbor any civilized inhabitants was beyond belief, but away to my left, Cunningly hidden behind the dense foliage of the matted trees stood a cabin. There was no sign of human life about the place, not even the semblance of a pathway, but the very existence of a permanent, man-made shack so far removed from any settlement was mystery enough to stir the blood of any adventurous soul. I started forward slowly, with the vague idea of unearthing some strange jungle secret, and emerged presently upon a little clearing, from where I surveyed the place with doubtful eyes. Few tools and very little skill had been utilized in the erection of that cabin. There were no windows. The wall logs were undaubed and irregular, some of them jutting far out at the corners, while the ill-fitting door, sagging pathetically upon rope hinges, gave to the whole a grotesque appearance. But it was not so much the appearance of the place as the intangible atmosphere of horror enveloping it which held me. Instinctively I distrusted that abandoned silence which seemed to beckon so innocently. Some brooding evil lay hidden there, waiting with cunning patience for the springing of a trap. But like the venturesome fool I was, I approached and laid my weight cautiously against the door. To my surprise, it resisted, and for a moment I speculated as to the wisdom of indulging my curiosity any further. That barred door indicated the presence of someone. Even as I hesitated, a man's soft, drawling voice sounded from within, holding me rigid with amazement. "I'll paddle down to the settlement next week, honey, and see if I can't pick up some new books for you. Reckon daughter can attend you satisfactorily until I return. Now try to sleep," soothingly. "You'll feel better in a little while." Women living in this god-forsaken spot, and a man of breeding, if I were of any judge. The whole thing was preposterous, but such was the evidence my hearers had gathered. Thinking that I could possibly be of some service in case of illness, I raised the butt end of my rifle and rapped. A deep silence followed. For a moment I experienced that unpleasant sensation of being passed upon by hidden eyes, and then the door slowly opened. Involuntarily I recoiled a step, scarcely knowing what to expect. A tall, broad-shouldered man appeared. There was in his carriage a certain flash of dignity which could not be concealed by the tattered garments he wore. His hair was gray and fell in wild disorder to his shoulders, framing a countenance seamed by years of suffering. For a moment he regarded me with deep-set, weary eyes. Then, "You are welcome, sir," he said, quietly in the same soft-toned drawl, and stood aside me to enter. I did so, feeling vaguely that the whole occurrence was a fragment of some senseless dream. The interior was fitfully illuminated by the daylight which filtered in between the undaubed logs, revealing a picture of strange barrenness. Except for a few sawed-off logs, evidently serving as chairs, and a large upturned box in the center, the room was bare of furnishings. Across one end of the structure was draped a long black cloth, which no doubt concealed the women. My strange host closed the door without barring it, and when I turned, I found his eyes searching me with an unfathomable expression which was decidedly unpleasant. "You'll pardon my intrusion," I said a bit awkwardly. "I spied your cabin on my way back to camp and thought I could be of some service. My name is Brent." "Glad to meet you, sir," he answered. "Visitors are a rare luxury with us. My name is Warner, Colonel Warner of Kentucky." There was a surprising power in his handclasp. "Unfortunately, the women are somewhat indisposed at present, but I'll tell them that you called, Mr. Brent. Won't you be seated, sir?" I sank down upon the nearest log, a highly perplexed man. The formality of it all would have been laughable were it not for the serious dignity of this surprising colonel. So far as he was concerned, we might have met in the drawing-room of some southern mansion. As for myself, I could not throw off the sense of tragedy which seemed to lurk beneath the surface. Visibly, there was nothing to fear, but the events of the last few minutes were too unnatural to put me at ease. Of a sudden, my roving eyes settled on the familiar lines of a pair of shabby-looking books resting on the box close by. I stared, and the colonel, evidently noticing my gaze, took up one of the volumes. "An excellent discourse, sir," said he, proffering me the volume, "but highly technical. Have you ever read it?" I thumbed the well-known cover. On the flyleaf, in my own handwriting, appeared my scrawly signature, James W. Brent. "One of the best treatises on the subject in existence," I declared. "Decidedly. I got it only a few days ago for Miss Warner. She loves books, but finds reading a hardship. Her sight is dim. So I read things aloud to her. We found that very interesting, sir." With a sigh, which was half moan, he subsided upon a log near the opposite wall, and I returned the book to its companion. Undoubtedly it was my own, but I found it difficult to believe that this well-bred gentleman, however peculiar, had committed the theft. I gazed at him curiously and found him staring vacantly into space with sagging jaw. Finally he spoke in a queer, detached manner. "Colonel Warner. It seems like ages since I heard that name. The Mad Colonel. That's what they call me." Then suddenly, "Have you ever heard them tell of the Mad Colonel?" I had not. "No matter." And he waved his hand in dismission of the thought. "You would not feel so secure in my presence with their wild tales running through your brain. I am not mad," and his tone was a shade of wonder. "Only the victim of a terrible vengeance. Do you see those pictures, Mr. Brent?" I had overlooked them before, two small photographs, framed in black, hanging on a wall behind me. One of an elderly lady, beautiful beyond doubt, the other of a captivating youngster. "My family, Mr. Brent." His eyes fairly glowed with the pleasure of the telling, but promptly recovered their weary expression. "We were happy once back in Kentucky. A rich family and well known, but disaster overtook us in the shape of a hopeless maniac, Andrew Lang." For a moment he was silent, staring down at the floor with bent head, his gray hair falling about his face. I glanced around, trying to conjure up some excuse for leaving. I had no desire to probe into his family secrets. Besides, that tense atmosphere of horror that overhung the place was anything but reassuring. I wanted to be gone, rather the wild things of the jungle than to be cooped up with what? I did not know, but I could sense some hidden terror, and involuntarily my eyes wandered to that crepe-like drapery which divided the cabin. I started to speak, but his soft voice interrupted, ignoring me completely. "I was telling you of Andrew Lang, the madman. I trusted him like a brother, and thought he was grateful until I discovered his perfidy. Lies and soft-tongued entreaties were his stock in trade. It was Mrs. Warner he wanted, sir. Cunning indeed were his methods. I killed him." I could scarcely repress a shudder. The whole thing was beginning to get on my nerves, but I could not stay his soft-toned drawl. Insanity had been the family blight of Andrew Lang. All 4 of his sons were afflicted. For years they haunted me from place to place, vowing to avenge their father's death with cruel torture. But I felt justified. The honor of the Warner name, my wife's happiness, my little Helen. His voice trembled. Tears started to his eyes. Then he drew himself erect with military dignity. Legally, I am a murderer, sir, and the law would not protect me from those 4 warped brains. I fled the country with my little family and took refuge here, in the heart of the jungle, where I thought I would be safe. But those cunning brains found me at last. His shoulders drooped and his form relaxed into the very picture of despair. When he spoke again, his voice was dull, expressionless. First one came, then the other, disguised. But I knew them, and in self-defense, I killed them. For a moment I thought the man was mad. His tale was fantastic enough, but one look at his forlorn figure seemed to reassure me. Sorrow and suffering were all the picture held. I was about to utter some words of sympathy when the door of the shack flew open and a harsh voice intruded. I started erect with quickened pulse. Framed in the doorway was a man clad in the khaki of the border rangers. One hand was poised lightly on the automatic in his belt. His eyes burned with triumph as they rested on the bent figure of the colonel, who had scarcely moved. "So we've got you at last," grimly. "At last," echoed the colonel, dully. "And a hell of a chase it was. 2 others were not so successful. You have no idea what happened to them." It was more of an accusation than a question. "I killed them, as I will you," was the colonel's toneless reply. "Why, damn your mad hide!" exploded the stranger wrathfully. Mad? Mad?" The colonel was on his feet with wildly glaring eyes, his hands working spasmodically. "You call me mad?" Suddenly he leapt forward, and one powerful arm shot out. Recoiling a step, the stranger whipped out his automatic. Simultaneously, I brought the butt of my rifle down on his arm. Something cracked. A low moan escaped his lips, and his weapon clattered to the floor. Then the colonel was upon him, his powerful hands clutched in a death grip on the stranger's throat. I tried to pull him off. It was useless. The stranger's face turned purple, and his body sagged. Then the colonel's rage subsided, and with a hissing intake of breath, he let his victim slip through his hands into a lifeless heap on the floor. A sickening nausea swept me at the hideous sight. I shuddered and turned away. The colonel seized my hand in his, and I could feel him tremble. "Thank you, sir," he whispered. "God only knows what would have become of my family. He was the 3rd. His voice faltered, and my heart went out to him in pity in spite of the murder just committed. Then, with a sudden movement, he turned and bent over the dead body of his enemy. Grasping the limp form beneath the armpits, he started to drag it across the rough boards of the cabin, and presently disappeared behind that mysterious barrier of black without a backward glance. A gruesome object to lay before the eyes of that unseen family of his. I studied that swaying curtain with puzzled eyes, trying to penetrate its secrets, and gradually grew conscious of a thin stream of red slowly oozing from beneath its low-hanging folds. I stared motionless, my brain beset with wild imaginations. Surely that slowly creeping line of red was blood. What thing of evil had I stumbled upon? What horror did that stable cloth conceal? I tiptoed across the floor and gently pulled back the curtain at one side. A weird sight met my eyes. The colonel was kneeling before an upturned box, his body bent like a worshipper before a shrine. Beside him, where he knelt, rested 3 shaggy human heads, one still wet with blood, while a decapitated form in blood-stained khaki lay huddled in a far corner. I heard the colonel speak, a horribly elated whisper. "You're safe, honey. He'll never get you. He can't. We'll fool them all. All. And he laughed. I stared with something akin to fascination at the repulsive sight. Suddenly he turned, sensing my presence. "Come in, sir," he cried. "Come in and meet the family. Mrs. Warner and little Helen." I saw that his eyes were bulging and his face working in a frenzy of maniacal emotion. With a cat-like movement he sprang to his feet, disclosing the idols of his worship, his family resting sphinx-like on the box before him. 2 empty, grinning skulls. A terrible weakness assailed me as I staggered away from that place of madness into the sanity of broad daylight. 5 days later, on arriving at the settlement downstream, I learned that 3 rangers had been sent out after the mad colonel somewhere up the river and that none had returned. I held my peace.
The stink of cigarettes and stale beer enveloped me as I pushed through the door of the last call. George Jones crooned from the jukebox, and across the crowded room, Sherry Carter balanced a tray of drinks. She weaved between tables, her red hair like a flame under the cloud of tobacco smoke. We'd gone out twice since I moved back, and I hoped there might be something there. When Sherry turned back to the bar, I waved. She lifted her chin and smiled, dimples creasing the corners of her mouth. I blushed like a teenager. "Downey Woodson, as I live and breathe." The man calling me wore a faded ball cap with a Confederate flag on the front. His smile revealed the black gap of missing teeth. My memory clicked in and I recognized Guy Lewis. I hadn't seen him since high school. The same age as me, Guy could have passed for 50. Guy waved me over. The man sitting beside him nodded. Another schoolmate, Wayne Hatch. I didn't have to guess at his name. It was embroidered in yellow thread on the pocket of his oil-stained uniform shirt. Wayne had been somebody in high school, football player, homecoming king. After he graduated, I enrolled in community college in Atlanta, and Wayne enlisted and went to Iraq. Now here he was, working at Jiffy Lube. I had a moment of satisfaction seeing that, remembering how he had let me hang around his little clique back then, like he was doing me a favor. "Hey, college boy, you come home to see how the other half lives?" Wayne flicked a line of ash from his cigarette and stuck out his hand. "It's not like that." I shook his hand, wondering if he had read my mind. "Maybe I got homesick, missed those boiled peanuts." "Well, hell, let me buy you a beer." Wayne pulled me over to the bar. He motioned Guy over, and I took the stool between them. "What are you doing these days?" The 2 men grinned. I shrugged. "Nothing much. Helping the old man in his welding shop. Hard to find work lately." The manufacturing plant where I had worked for 10 years folded, outdone by Chinese imports. My marriage went under at the same time as my job. My ex-wife kept the house, and I crawled back home to Jays Creek, Georgia, just until I could get back on my feet. Mom had turned my old bedroom into a craft room. I slept on the swayback twin bed I'd had in high school, pushed against the wall next to my mother's sewing machine. One drink led to another 3. The clock edged close to midnight when we wandered over to the beer-stained pool table. "You always were a stand-up guy." Wayne clinked his bottle against mine. "Whatever happened to that old Chevy you had?" He rubbed the cube of blue chalk across the tip of his pool cue. "Sold it." I leaned over the pool table and made my shot. I hadn't been a jock like Guy and Wayne, and I wasn't smart enough to blend in with the college prep kids. My most redeeming feature had been that I owned a car roomy enough to fit 4 passengers. In high school, I'd been the one tapped to drive them across the state line so Wayne could buy beer with a fake ID. Wayne made the final shot right before the bar closed. hitting the 8-ball with a clack. It dropped into the corner pocket. You working at your old man's shop? He got a portable cutting torch? Well, yeah. Most of our work is in shop, though. Why? I tilted my bottle and drank the last lukewarm swallow. Let's go for a drive. I hung my cue on the rack and we strolled outside. Before we reached Wayne's truck, the neon sign above the bar flickered out, leaving the lot in darkness. I hesitated, torn between curiosity and a desire to go home and sleep off the buzz. Guy waved me on. He opened the door of Wayne's truck and fished a pint of wild turkey bourbon from under the seat. Guy twisted the cap and handed it over. What the hell? I took the bottle and choked down the drink. The whiskey jolting me awake one instant, then settling in my stomach like a warm coal. Wayne gripped my arm and leaned close to my face. His bloodshot, watery eyes stared into mine. I'm gonna show you something that will change your life. At that point, I could have said no thanks, climbed into my car, and gone home to sleep in that twin bed, springs poking up into my back. Instead, I went along with them just like I'd done in high school, like the past 15 years hadn't happened. We piled into Wayne's 20-year-old Ford pickup, me in the middle with my leg pressed up against the shifter. The truck motor rumbled back to life, and with a crunch of gravel, we were on the road. I figured we'd end up either at a still in the middle of the woods or a trailer home meth lab. The truck swayed around curves, rocking on worn-out shocks. The hum of the motor, the road heat rising through the floorboards, coupled with the buzz from the whiskey, lulled me into a half-waking, half-dreaming state. I jolted awake when the truck stopped. Guy elbowed me.
Time to rise and shine.
Where are we? I rubbed my eyes and squinted at the rutted path lit by the Ford's headlights. The front bumper rested before a rusted cattle gate. Guy hopped out. I shook my head, trying to bring the unfamiliar landscape into focus. Wayne flipped off the truck's headlights as Guy unlocked a padlock chain wound through the bars. We drove through, and Guy closed the creaking gate behind us. Waist-high weeds hid the edges of the drive. The truck bounced down the track in the dark, lit only by the moon overhead. At last, Wayne eased the truck to a stop in front of a sagging wood-frame house. Weeds sprung up between the missing boards of the porch. We walk from here. Wayne stepped from the truck. He reached into a cooler in the truck bed and brought out 3 brown bottles dripping from melted ice. We hiked along a dirt path cut through tall Johnson grass that slashed at our jeans, toward a thick line of brush and trees. Wayne led the way down a single track barely visible in the moonlight. Guy fell in behind me, and the 3 of us stumbled through the woods. We emerged in a clearing bisected by rusted train tracks and overrun by weeds. Right here. Wayne twisted the top from one of the bottles he held. He flung the cap at the tracks, then handed me the bottle. Beer foamed over the top, the cold liquid spilling onto my hand.
We found it a couple months back,
Guy began, then stopped when Wayne frowned at him. Less you know, the better, Wayne said. I laughed, a nervous sound in the dark. But we ain't about to get arrested for trespassing, are we?
Nah, that's my aunt's place back there,
Guy said. She lives out here all by herself? I pointed my beer bottle towards the dark silhouette of the house.
She ain't around no more.
Guy tossed an arm across my shoulders and led me into the middle of the track.
Check this out.
We stood between the rails. I scuffed a boot across bits of rotted wood. Guy bounced on his feet, humming. Showtime! Wayne stiffened and turned towards us. A dim yellow light floated behind his head. The ground trembled under my feet, as though something huge and monstrous approached. The light grew closer and brighter. The clatter of a locomotive sounded. Guy jumped from the track, laughing. I stumbled backward. My foot caught the edge of the rail and I fell to my knees. I looked up, blinded by the light from the train. A whistle sounded impossibly loud. I scrambled to my feet as Wayne grabbed the collar of my shirt, yanking me to safety. And then the locomotive was upon us. Steam billowed from the stack, the great black cow catcher on the front sweeping down the gleaming rails. Hot air rushed past, mixed with the stink of burning coal and metal. I stared, frozen in place less than 5 feet from the train. Wayne still gripped my collar as I bent into the rush of hot air from the locomotive. It couldn't be real. Like someone standing at the edge of a cliff and longing to jump, I swayed towards the train. Wayne jerked me back. Trembling, I drained my beer and chucked the bottle at the last car, expecting it to pass through the train as though through a cloud. Instead, the bottle exploded against the metal wheels, the clink of breaking glass all but overpowered by the thunder of the wheels. A face, pale and round with dead black holes for eyes, pressed against the window.
Hot damn!
Guy whooped and chucked his bottle. It spun through the train and disappeared into the grass on the other side of the tracks. The train rolled along, the image of it flickering like a broken movie reel, and faded to nothing as it left the clearing. I spun and punched Guy. He staggered back, clutching his jaw.
Why'd you do that?
Was that real? It could have killed me. Guy stooped and picked up a chunk of wet glass.
As real as it gets, bro. You feel it? Yeah, it could have punched your ticket.
Civil War ghost train. Wayne scuffed a boot at the weeds choking the rusted rails. It's the Andersonville train, carrying gold to pay the Confederate soldiers.
Guess no one told them the war ended.
Guy threw back his head and howled a rebel yell, his voice warbling and rising. You're talking about that old legend? Everyone in Jay's Creek knew the story. Somewhere near our little town, a Confederate train had crashed, leaving behind a rumor of lost gold. Hell, I'd searched for it myself as a kid, scouring the fields filled with brambles and earning nothing but sunburn and poison ivy for my trouble. That train never made it past this valley. No one knows what happened to the gold. There's some sort of doorway here. The train gets solid the closer we get to the full moon. When it passes that curve, it fades until you can't see it anymore. Wayne pointed down the track, where broken rails bent and rose to curve around a hill. This here's the only spot she's real. My head spun. How was that thing here? I gestured toward the rusted tracks. How did you find it? Wayne shook his head. The only thing that matters is she's real. He grinned and slung his arm around me, pulling me close. Hot beer-scented breath brushed my ear. Because tomorrow night's the full moon, and we're gonna rob that train. It's not love of money at the root of evil. It's the lack of it that causes the hurt. I lied to my old man that morning, skipped work and told him I wasn't feeling well, when the only thing wrong with me was too much alcohol the night before. Now here I was, waiting in a dark parking lot for 2 men who'd barely tolerated me in high school and were using me now like they used me back then. I couldn't get the night before out of my mind. According to the stories I found on the internet, the Andersonville train had been carrying Union prisoners when it derailed somewhere east of Jay's Creek. The closest estimates on the websites put the missing gold at over $1 million in current value. That much money would get me out of Mom's sewing room. I leaned against my car's cooling hood. I was parked at the edge of the lot at the last call, far away from the blue and green glow of the neon lights. I placed a backpack with the portable cutting torch at my feet. Like Wayne had ordered, I wore black jeans and a solid black t-shirt. My coat, a long duster, reached to my ankles. I added a black knit cap snug around my ears. While I waited, I dug an antacid from the roll stashed in my car's glove box. The chalky peppermint taste did little to settle my stomach. I'd half hoped they wouldn't show when the headlights from Wayne's truck split the night. The moment it rolled to a stop, Guy threw open the truck door, leaned out, and called me over. He had a rifle cradled on his lap. That's some massive firepower. I paused, half in and half out of the truck. Is that an AR? Guy laughed.
What? You think we're gonna rob a train with a pocket knife?
Stash your gear and get in. We need to be moving. Wayne shifted in his seat, revealing the handle of a black pistol stuck in a holster on his hip. Do I get a gun? I asked. Only thing you need is that torch, Wayne answered. I stepped onto the running board and checked the gas levels on the oxy and acetylene tanks for the 100th time. Before I pushed everything under the toolbox, I hesitated, then pulled the heavy pry bar out of the backpack and stashed it in the deep inner pocket of my coat. Satisfied, I shoved the pack next to a green plastic lantern case. Wayne and Guy both wore gray wool coats and pants. They looked straight out of a Civil War reenactment. Wayne steered the truck down moonlit roads. I tried to recognize our route, to remember the way we went this time. In the dark, most of those one-lane country roads looked the same. When we got to the gate, Guy handed me the padlock key and nudged me to jump out. I fumbled with the lock until it released and the clasp fell open. We bounced along the track from the night before and stopped at the abandoned house. The front door hung open on broken hinges. A stack of yellowing newspaper fluttered on the porch. Guy had said his aunt wasn't around anymore. I didn't think she'd be coming back. We climbed out of the truck, Guy whistling Dixie until Wayne snapped at him. Shut up! No sense telling the whole county where we are. I grabbed the backpack with the torch while Wayne lit the lantern. He rose, holding the light up and inspecting the flame. What if the train doesn't stop? Images flooded my head. Guy and Wayne sucked into the path of the locomotive and ground to meat under the metal wheels.
If it doesn't, no loss to you. We'll be the ones taking the risk.
Guy grinned.
That train runs us over, then you just gotta scurry on back to your mama's.
Cut the shit and let's go. Wayne struck off along the narrow path to the tracks. At the clearing, Wayne motioned me toward a stand of brush. You wait here. Hunker down so they don't see you until the train stops. Then come up behind us. I crouched there in the dark, hidden behind the glossy leaves of a mountain laurel. The full moon lit the space in cool white light. My backpack rested against my leg, and I kept one hand on the strap, ready to rush out as soon as the train rolled to a stop, if it stopped. The image of that dead face I'd seen in the window the night before flashed through my mind. 15 feet in front of me, Wayne and Guy waited beside the track. Guy with his rifle slung over his shoulder, and Wayne gripping the lantern. In the circle of yellow light, the two of them looked gaunt and worn down, like they'd just stepped off a battlefield. Black smears of dirt and oil dotted their gray wool pants and coats. Beard stubble shadowed Wayne's face, and Guy's brow was hidden under a crushed gray cap. Wayne wore the leather satchel slung over his shoulder. Right at midnight, a train whistle sounded, low and mournful. I straightened and shrugged on the backpack. Wayne lifted the lantern and swung it back and forth as they stepped onto the track. Behind them, I held my breath as the train appeared. The locomotive's headlight was a great yellow eye above the sweep of the cowcatcher. I looked away, afraid to watch. A wrenching squeal sounded as the metal wheels ground against the rails and slowed, stopping less than a yard from Wayne and Guy. The train waited, smoke rising from its stack. I studied the dark windows on the train cars, hoping I wouldn't spot a face peering out. Careful to stay outside the circle of light cast by Wayne's lantern, I shuffled forward. With a creak, the door to the cab car behind the engine swung open, and a lone soldier stepped out. His bony wrists hung down past the frayed edges of his gray uniform shirt. The cuffs of his gray trousers were rolled up over his boots. Flaking mud covered both pants and boots. Faint blonde hair dotted his pale cheeks. He looked no older than a teenager, too young for the rifle slung across his chest. The boy stared out into the distance. Wayne lowered the lantern and greeted him. "Permission to board?" We've come from Atlanta with a message for your commanding officer. He slid a hand inside his shirt and pulled out the corner of an envelope. The soldier nodded and motioned us aboard. I stepped onto the train behind Wayne and Guy. The locomotive stack belched a cloud of white steam as the train shut down, crouched on the tracks like a large hungry animal, a predator for sure. Before I passed through the door to the car, I glanced behind us toward the engine. The space where the engineer would ride was empty. We trudged down the passenger car's narrow aisle, following our escort. I pulled my coat aside to keep it from catching on the wooden seats. Flickering lanterns hung from the posts near the car's ceiling, casting feeble light across the soldiers slumped across the benches. A foul odor filled the space, the stink of piss, shit, and rotten meat. More than half the soldiers were dressed in Union blue. Chains circled their ankles. In all the talk of missing gold, I never pictured what a prison train would be like. Almost all the men, Confederate and Union both, had blood-stained bandages wrapped around some part of their body. Their vacant stares met mine until I dropped my gaze to the scarred wooden boards under our feet. We passed through that car and into the silent open air. Gone were the usual night sounds, the chirp of crickets, the whistle and call of night birds, the humph of bullfrogs. The soldier ushered us through another car, filled with prisoners, and out again to the third car on the train. The soldier halted at the entrance to the last car and told us to wait. When he came out, he nodded to us and held the door while we tromped through. Wayne swung his head around and grinned at me. "Showtime," he whispered. "At ease, Lieutenant." The officer speaking rose from behind the small table. A rough salt and pepper beard covered the bottom half of the man's face. He braced his arms against the tabletop and pushed aside the map he had been studying. His hands were red and chapped, and scabs dotted the knuckles. Our escort took up a position with his back to the door we had just walked through. He shifted his weight and leaned against the door frame, and kept both hands on the rifle. I glanced around the cramped car. The officer's desk was to our right. A folded berth hung closed against the wall above it. At the end of the space was a wash basin with a mirror above. On our left, partly hidden beside a storage closet, I spied the safe. "You have a communication for me?" The officer held out his hand. "We do indeed," Wayne answered. He reached into his coat. Instead of a letter, he drew out his pistol and shot the officer, then spun and shot the young soldier too. The soldier left a thick trail of crimson as he slid down the wall. His rifle clattered to the floor. I stared at the stripe of blood, wondering how the dead could be killed again. The officer collapsed into the chair, one arm flung out, palm up, as though pleading with us. Blood ran from the black hole in his chest. He wheezed a sucking breath and raised a hand to point at us. "You go to hell." Wayne lifted the pistol and shot the man between the eyes. Bits of bone and brain splattered against the train car wall behind him. The dead officer fell forward, across the map spread out over the table. I clasped my stomach and bent over, gasping. No time for that shit." Guy nudged me with his rifle. "You got a job to do." My ears rang from the gunfire, but I got his message. Shaken, I knelt in front of the safe and hooked up the tanks to the torch. The metallic sulfur stink of the gunpowder hung in the air. I coughed. "Won't someone come running after hearing those shots?" "You worry about opening that safe." Wayne stood over me, the pistol against his leg. Guy stepped over the dead soldier and trotted out the door. I turned my back on Wayne and studied the safe, rapping the metal side with my knuckles. It was squat and black, with an ornate gilded plate on the front. Cast iron, most likely, just as my web research had mentioned. I lit the torch. The flame's hiss sounded as though it were underwater. I knelt and touched the steady blue fire to the side of the safe and began to cut. My world narrowed to the job at hand. Sparks like fireworks sprang from the path of the cutting torch. Cast iron doesn't cut easily. I moved the torch in an arc, heating the metal until gradually a gap began to form where the flame scored the side. My hearing returned enough that over the noise of the torch I heard the rapid pop of gunfire. I flinched with each shot, but I held the cutting flame steady. I couldn't help but picture those soldiers chained to the benches in the cars ahead. The knowledge that they had been dead for over a century did little to justify the massacre. Guy burst through the door as I made the last sweep with the torch. I switched off the gas. "All clear?" Wayne nodded towards the door. Guy sucked in a breath.
Hell yeah, I rained down on them like Judgment Day.
A line of red traced down his brow and across the side of his face. I hoped one of the soldiers had gotten in a blow or a shot. "What are you waiting for?" Wayne motioned with the pistol. "Crack her open." "It's too hot to touch." I knelt beside the safe and held my hand over the side. The metal radiated heat. I reached for the pry bar in my coat pocket when a pistol shot rang out. Guy's body hit the floor next to me. His dead eyes bulged from the pressure of the bullet that took out a good chunk of his brain. I looked up into the barrel of Wayne's gun. My fingers wrapped around the pry bar. I rose, swinging the heavy bar at Wayne. It made contact with his wrist as he pulled the trigger. I felt the crunch of bone through the bar. The bullet scored a hot trail across my upper arm. Wayne dropped the gun and I kicked it spinning across the floor. It whirled to a stop next to the dead soldier's thigh. I raised the bar again.
"Stay back! What the fuck, Wayne?"
He gripped his broken wrist, then lunged toward the gun. I swung the pry bar again, this time catching him on the back of his head. Wayne collapsed, moaning. He rolled over and swung his good arm at me. I brought the bar down on his knee. Wayne screamed. I scooped up the gun. For good measure, I grabbed Guy's rifle and the dead soldier's weapon, stashing them behind me. I held the gun on Wayne. He sat up, blood running from the wound on his head. Tears streamed down his face.
"You think this is it? You just gonna walk off this train with the gold?"
Wayne spat on the floor.
"Hell, I should have had Guy shoot you as soon as he came back in. He wanted to, you know? There never was gonna be a three-way split."
"And not a two-way either, huh?" Wayne slumped against the wall, the soldier's corpse on one side, Guy's body sprawled on the other. Satisfied Wayne wasn't going anywhere, I pocketed the gun and turned to the safe. I wedged the pry bar into the gap I'd cut in the side and threw my weight against it. The safe gave way with a squeal of metal and the portion I'd cut dropped off. The sides of the holes were still hot, so I knelt and used the pry bar to rake the contents out. Bits of charred paper money fluttered from the safe. The heat from the torch had lit a fire inside the safe. A handful of coins followed, spilling from a burnt cloth sack. No gold. Ignoring the heat, I reached in and swept the bottom of the safe with my hand. Nothing. I clutched one of the coins, then threw it at Wayne.
"Here's your treasure."
Wayne picked up the coin and studied it.
"It's not even real money. This here is a token."
He choked out a terrible laugh that ended in a scream. I rose from the floor, intent on grabbing my gear and leaving the train, when I felt a shudder under my feet. The train was moving.
"Hey!"
Wayne reached out a hand.
"Don't leave me!"
A gurgle issued from the dead officer, slumped over the map table. He rose like a puppet pulled by strings, until he sat up once more in his chair. His wounds closed with sucking sounds. Transfixed, I didn't realize the soldier until he clutched one of my legs.
"Ah!"
I kicked at the corpse. Wayne dragged himself toward the door at the front of the car. The train picked up speed. Outside the car's window, I spied dark trees moving past in slow motion. I swung the backpack, weighted with the metal gas cylinders, and hit the soldier. His jaw flapped sideways, broken, and he let me go. I leapt for the door at the rear of the car. Horrible noises filled the train car. Wayne screaming and shuffling, scrabbling noises. Just before I flung the door open and jumped from the moving locomotive, I glanced in the mirror above the wash basin. What I saw made me freeze for an instant. Guy sitting up and reaching for Wayne. I made my way back through the woods to where Wayne had parked his truck by the empty house. He had left the keys in the ignition. I drove back to the last call and wiped my prints from the truck. I went home and lay awake on my twin bed. After a few days, Wayne's folks reported him missing, and there was a search for him and Guy. Nothing ever came of it. A month went by before I went back to the train in time for the full moon. I waited through most of the night, but nothing ever came. They'd gotten what they needed from us, I figure, and moved on to wherever restless spirits go. I took something from that train, though. The cloth of sack coins, tokens, just like Wayne said. Turned out they were valuable after all. Not as much as gold, but still enough to put a down payment on the land where Guy's aunt had lived. It went up for auction for unpaid taxes shortly after I sold the coins. I'll tear down the house and build a new one for Sherry and me. Some nights, when the moon is full, I'll venture down to the tracks and wait. I'll wait to see if that locomotive passes by, and a familiar face with dead eyes stares from the window.
Life is weird sometimes. Going through life thinking everything is normal. Nothing bad could ever happen. Not really. In retrospect, that was an ignorant thought. I know better now. No one is safe anywhere. Sure, I don't live somewhere generally known to be dangerous, like the Middle East, where violence is as normal as eating butter on bread. But living the city life can be just as risky, easily. Danger takes a different form. You never know when you will be naturally selected to experience it firsthand. I've been living in the same townhouse for 5 years, and nothing bad has ever happened. Every day was the same. I would start my day at 6 a.m. sharp, stumble down the stairs and make my morning brew. After a quick shower, I'm dressed and pulling the car out of the garage. I work in an office, the usual situation. It's what you would expect it to be. Computers, cubicles, internal corporate domination over a gaggle of underpaid and overworked average individuals. 9 hours later, I drive to the store, pick up my glorified organic food, and come home for a quiet evening. Nothing truly bad ever happens. Maybe a stubbed toe, running over the curb every now and then. Occasionally, the toilet becomes inconveniently clogged, resulting in an overreacted act of unclogging and a sigh of exasperated relief as the water finally swirls away. I've been spoiled and jaded all at once, living such a peaceful existence. People don't think that way so often anymore. Peace is valuable. I miss it. One evening, I was sitting in my living room, minding my own business with a book and a steaming cup of tea, when something moved by my window. I didn't see anything definitively, but I knew the rosemary bush planted under the window had shaken. It was just about 6:30, so the sun was beginning to set, creating the mistiest gentle blue, pink, and purple hue across everything the light touched. My eyes focused on the window, pausing in a frozen stare to see if it happened again. Nothing. I shrugged and returned to reading fabulous facts surrounding our climate and what should be done about it. A black shadow crossed my vision, and again the bush shook, and I turned back to the window quickly. It barely rustled and then became still, as though its disruptor decided to occupy elsewhere. Well, that's interesting, I said as I set the book down. I went to the window and looked out curiously, hoping to see a bird of some kind or maybe a squirrel. There was nothing of interest besides a grasshopper stretching out its legs, a simple rosemary bush. The doorbell rang, which made me nearly jump out of my skin. I stared at the door, a sense of anxiety building. I wasn't expecting a package nor any visitors. This struck me as strange, and I considered not answering. The doorbell rang out again, followed by 3 steady, heavy knocks. Something doesn't feel right. I'll go look out the window upstairs. I thought this out loud, hopping 2 steps at a time up the stairs and peering out the hallway window, exposing my front lawn and a large blue van parked in my driveway. No signage, just a neat, almost new, unmarked blue van with black tinted windows. Tires were dirty. It looked like dried mud. This was strange, considering there wasn't any rain in the area today, and my home isn't near any forests. This is the city. We have cement grass. 3 more knocks sounded downstairs. This person did not want to go away. But seeing this van, I felt uneasy. There's no way I'm opening up for someone with your vibes, whoever you are, I mumbled, continuing to peer, hoping the unexpected guest would leave and I could see who wanted me to open the door for them. Long, stressful moments passed, and the knocking finally ceased. A pale man emerged from my entryway. He was tall, with a fluff of blonde hair bobbing as he slowly strode to his van. Wearing a black shirt, pants, belt, shoes, and socks, he appeared nearly ghost-like. He stopped in front of the door to the driver's seat. He just stood there, staring into the van. Was he talking to someone? I couldn't tell to be sure. Was there another? Why are they here? Why is he still standing there? Why isn't he leaving? These thoughts rushed me. Anxiety continued to crawl into my mind as leeches seeped into my skin. Seeds of panic began to grow as the pale man slowly turned his head back to the front door of my home. His steady gaze slowly climbed the wall, and time seemed so surreal. Eyes focused with an intensity I've not seen before. Up to my window, looking me in the eyes. My mouth fell open in surprise, and I lurched away quickly, letting the curtains fall back into place. My heart was slamming in my chest now. He knew I was watching. He knew where to look. How did he know what window to look into? How did he know? How did he know? I took a deep breath and moved back to the window on my hands and knees. I felt foolish, crawling like a child, hoping my parents didn't catch me sneaking into the kitchen at bedtime. I peeked through the smallest possible crease in the curtain to look outside. The van was gone. It vanished like it never existed in the first place. I didn't hear the van start up, no squeaking tires or clang of metal, just nothing. What the fuck was that? I got off my knees, ran my hands through my sweat-laced hair, and let out a flustered breath, taking in another shallow one as a poor replacement. I peeked through again, staring intently at my lawn. I felt my courage come back to me, giving me energy. Nothing is out of place. I know they were here. This is weird. Going downstairs, I checked the windows just in case. Also the back door. You never know. I looked at the front door. Locked, of course, but I was curious. Unlatching the lock, I opened the door and stared out into the world. A beautiful setting sun, a quiet suburban street, a cozy doormat displaying the cheesy domesticated welcome message, "Who's there?" A duo of colorful owls to emphasize the joke, and a rosemary sprig sits lightly on top of the biggest owl's face. The next day, things were normal for the most part. My morning routine was the same, nothing out of the ordinary. I had a dream about the rosemary sprig. Thinking back, I wonder if my subconscious was more in tune with my surroundings than I was. Coming home that night, I scanned the roads for the blue van with the muddy wheels. The roads were congested, as usual, around the 5 o'clock rush hour, but no blue van. I pulled into the driveway and looked up at the window I was standing in the day before. The curtains were closed, as I would always have them. Today, I did leave a light on upstairs to give the impression someone might be home, just in case they came by while I was gone. Once inside, I brewed my tea and took a nap in the living room. My eyes thickened behind closed eyelids. They became so heavy the blackness overtook me as I drifted into a relaxing sleep, the smell of fresh hot tea wafting under my nose. I awoke to an abrupt bang with a startled gasp. It was dark now, with just the lamplight illuminating my small living room. I sat up in the chair and listened to the now silent house. My breath caught in my throat as 3 hard knocks rapped on my front door at a slow, deliberate pace. In the same way they had come from the pale blonde man that had come the day before. I felt my heart skip beats as I fumbled in the drawer next to me for the pepper spray I bought at the dollar store 2 years ago. Hopefully pepper spray doesn't expire, I mumbled, fumbling with the little plastic switch to activate the release just as the knocking began again. Peeking around the corner, one eye gets a clear shot of the front door and blonde tresses shining so clearly under the porch light through the faded glass. Crap! I crawled on my knees through the living room and kitchen, hoping he would disappear. As I settled on my kitchen floor, I breathed in and out rapidly. It grew silent. Long moments passed again. I stayed on the floor, trembling with the pepper spray locked in my iron grip, ready to spray the hell out of anything that dared try to hurt me. The clock read 10:32 p.m. on my stove. My eyes stayed glued to that clock for what seemed like an eternity. The neon green numbers eventually ticked to 10:33 p.m. and I let out a breath I forgot I was holding in. This is not good. I thumped my head against the cabinet and sighed, taking in the heavy silence. Click. There was a clicking noise now. It seemed so close, but I couldn't place its source. Click, click, click. I tilted my head, scrunching my eyebrows together as I tried to concentrate. Click. I honed my ears in on the new, unwelcome sound. Slowly turning my head, I looked up at the back door in my kitchen, leading into the yard. Click, click, click. I watched the doorknob twist and pop back into place, and my eyes nearly bulged out of my skull as I realized I was in a new level of danger. This person was trying to break in. At this point, 911 was in my immediate future. I lunged for my phone sitting on the counter. I dialed the emergency line and hid in the pantry, delicately clicking the door into place with as little sound as possible.
911, what's your emergency?
She sounded bored, like this was her first call in hours, and she'd just been sitting at her desk, flipping through Cosmo with a rock star to get through the night. Some freaky man is trying to break into my house, I whispered with alarm, dropping the cell phone and picking it up quickly. The speaker piece was in my ear, and I tried to speak into the hearing piece. I flipped the phone around in a panicked rage and heard the operator mid-sentence.
Unlikely. So are you sure they're trying to break in? They aren't just a telemarketer?
I could hear the rustling of plastic, followed by the operator munching on something crisp. What? Yeah, I'm sure. Telemarketers don't even... Oh, just never mind. Just send someone, now. A loud bang echoed through the kitchen outside of my hiding place. I peeked through the pantry slats at the man standing in my kitchen, the back door hanging limply off its hinges. He loomed with an energy that exuded ominous and treacherous intent. Looking around slowly, turning this way and that, he surveyed the area. He didn't have any bags. It didn't seem like he was going to take anything, which only meant he wanted something else. After a prolonged period of silence, the man spoke.
Where are you?
He said this in a voice that reminded me of a sinkhole filled to the brim with poisonous snakes, hissing and slithering all over each other to collect heat for their cold-blooded bodies.
I know you're here, or I would not be.
He settled his hands together behind his back and openly walked about my kitchen, peeking into the hallway, the bathroom, and up the stairway before returning to the kitchen. A sickly wide smile beamed across his crooked, cracked, and broken teeth.
You cannot hide from me. I can smell your fear.
He stood there, legs apart in a dominant way, with his hands relaxed behind his back, smiling. I clasped my hand over my mouth to steady myself. I didn't want him to find me or even have the possibility to hear my breath. 2 tears betrayed my waning bravery as they trickled down my cheeks and stuck to my chin. My body's violent shaking allowed the droplets to pop to the ground as the man turned to the pantry door. He tilted his head to the side.
There you are.
I let out a frightened gasp, and he laughed in what seemed to be a sick and twisted delight.
Come out, so we can play.
He coaxed, taking slow steps towards the door, head still cocked to the side, at an angle that made me nauseous. In this moment, there were 2 options: fight or flight. Being a young girl in her mid-20s, having never experienced anything similar in her sheltered life before this moment, running made all the sense in the world. The pale man's slender, bony fingers gripped the doorknob of the pantry and opened it with a rush, a loud slam erupting into the room as the door smashed into the wall. I screamed as loud as humanly capable and lunged out of the pantry, armed with a neon yellow mop that I swung furiously, like a panicked monkey gone bonkers at the zoo. The mop cracked the man in the head, and he cried out in rage, stopping the mop in his grip before I could strike him again. Releasing my impromptu weapon, it bounced on the tile, and I sprayed him in the face with pepper spray before running through the living room into the main hallway. I fumbled with shaking fingers to undo the lock on the front door. Tears streamed down my cheeks and blurred my vision. I could hear his agonizing screams.
You fucking bitch!
He wiped his eyes and bumped into walls as he attempted to follow me. A lamp crashed somewhere behind me. I punched the door in a frightened rage. "Open, damn it!" I shouted, banging on the knob and finally getting the lock undone. I swung open the door and didn't look back as I heard the glass embedded in the door shatter. I sprinted down my driveway, right past the dirty blue van and into the street, screaming my head off for help to anyone who could be listening. Footsteps plodded behind me, trailing along my path onto the main road. There were no streetlights or cars, just me, this bizarre pale ghost of a man, and the darkness of the night. I sprinted up the hill toward the main intersection of Maple and Warner, where streetlights fully illuminated the road, and a convenience store gleamed like the lights of heaven just on the other side. I can make it. I just need to get there, and I'll be safe. I just need to get there. I huffed, my legs aching as I pushed them to continue sprinting up the hill. I laughed in exasperated joy and relief when the convenience store came into view. I didn't even stop at the intersection. I kept running off the sidewalk into the street. I didn't even see the blue van speeding toward me. Before I could stop, the blue van collided and slammed me into the windshield. My body rocket launched down the street in a flurry of glass shards, like something out of a poorly produced action film. I landed into an old oak tree with a sick, crunching thud. And the last thing I saw through the blurring, bloody remainder of my eyes was someone getting out of the blue van. The pale blonde man. How? He was right behind me. How did he do that? As I slipped into the black abyss of unconsciousness, I saw another figure emerge from the shadows. The figure came into the intersection's light and stood next to the pale man. Both men stared at my mangled mess of a body mashed against the old oak tree. Both men smiled, a sick, toothy, broken smile, followed by giddy laughter. They were the same. They were both the same man. Completely identical in every way. How? They walked toward me in sync, and the world sank into darkness. The next day, things were normal for the most part. My morning routine was the same, nothing particularly out of the ordinary. I dreamed about the rosemary sprig. Thinking back, I wonder if my subconscious was more in tune with my surroundings than I was. Coming home that night, I scanned the roads for the blue van with the muddy wheels. The roads were congested as usual around the 5 o'clock rush hour. I sat at the intersection just before turning onto Maple Drive. I stared at that street sign until my eyes ached. I felt like it was important, but I needed to figure out why. The same street sign was there yesterday and the day before. Nothing special. The light turned green, and I made my turn. There was not a blue van in sight. I pulled into the driveway and looked up at the window I was standing in the day before. The curtains were closed, as I would always have them. Today I did leave a light on upstairs to give the impression someone might be home, just in case they came by while I was gone. I've had the strangest feeling inside me all day, like I'm dreaming while wide awake. I sat in the driveway for a while, scrunching my eyebrows together in quiet contemplation. Today went so well, but why do I feel like something has changed? No, something hasn't changed. This day, it already happened? No. That couldn't be true. But why do I remember this? Well, it's not like I don't do this daily. I talked to myself as I unlocked my door and took one long glance out at the world before closing the door. Once inside, I brewed my tea and took a nap. I blinked awake groggily some hours later, the moon gleaming through my living room window, the smell of settled tea wafting by my nose. Walking through the hallway, I flipped the light on and headed up the stairs to get some laundry started. Closing the washer and setting the dial to delicate on cold, the washer beeped to life and began to process its purpose. Satisfied, I closed the door to the laundry room and turned to the stairwell, freezing mid-step. Standing at the end of the hall was the man dressed in all black, his hands folded behind him, and he stared me down as a pit bull does raw meat. His bloodshot eyes impaled me.
So, we meet again. How's your head? I'm impressed.
The man said with that same broad grin, yellowed and all. The fuck are you talking about? Get the hell out of my house! I shouted, seizing my limited opportunity to back up into my bedroom and slam it in his pale freak of a face. I pushed the dresser in front of the door and tore apart my bedroom looking for my cell phone. 3 knocks and raps on the door.
If you're looking for your cell phone, Mommy says hello.
The man said through the door, laughing maniacally in his own amusement. I kicked the dresser in response. "Eat me, prick!" I shouted, suddenly wishing I had listened to my mom and just had the landline phone installed for emergencies. There was a pause, and then the maniacal laughter ripped through the air.
Gladly,
the man shouted and giggled with joy, followed by the horrible cracking sound of wood as he repeatedly beat the door with his foot to break it down. Shaking, I scanned the room for a makeshift weapon. I went into the bathroom and closed the door, locking it. I heard the banging continue as I searched, the sound of cracking wood pounding in my thoughts. Searching through drawer after drawer, I found only a small set of scissors and razors to use as my defense. Fumbling with the razors, I looked up in the mirror for a moment and screamed. There, standing in my shower, watching me, was the pale man. He launched from the shower, laughing as I sprung away from him, screaming bloody murder. He grabbed my shoulder and I took the opportunity to take one of the razor blades and clap around his wrist, skinning him as he cried out in pain. Blood ran down his arm and I released him, running out of the bathroom while he remained there cursing, occupied by his injured arm. Now back in the bedroom, the dresser had been knocked over, and the first man, now halfway, stepped through the huge hole he had kicked in the door. Oh shit, now what? Looking around the room, I spotted my table lamp and an internal light bulb lit in my brain.
You can't run now. Nowhere to go. Nowhere to hide.
He pulled his other lanky leg through the hole and stepped off my dresser smoothly, staring me down. The other man came through the bathroom, bleeding and notably pissed off.
I want the first straw. She cut my damn arm.
He growled my way, pointing at bloody gashes streaking along his forearm. The first man gave him a look and casually waved his hand, and the cut twin grinned and wasted no time in stomping my way, arms stretched and reaching to strangle the life out of me with blood-soaked hands. I backed away in the direction of my nightstand, and when close enough, I reached behind and took hold of the lamp. He dangled me above the ground with a strength I had not expected from such a slender person. He gripped my neck so tight, I felt my face redden with pressure. My eyes bulged slightly, and I began to sputter for air. The lamp was still in my fainting grasp, and I used every bit of energy I could muster to smash him in the face with it. He screamed, releasing me and covering his face as wedges of sharp ceramic fell to the floor, followed by large, seeping pools of blood. He flailed wildly and gripped me by my hair, slamming my head into the other dresser. The flat screen swayed and toppled over with a loud crash. As the first twin joined in, I pulled the scissors from my back pocket and stabbed him into the side of his neck without hesitation. Shrieking, the man fell to his knees and then toppled to the floor, drowning in the blood pouring from his body. The body twitched awkwardly. I stood there, watching him waste away, feeling triumphant. Kneeling, I gripped his blonde hair and pulled his head up. That's what you get for breaking into my house, you piece of shit. I released my grip and let his head smack the floor with an audible thump. As I stood up, I felt hands take hold of the back of my shirt and was instantly reminded I had only won the battle, not the war.
It's time for you to die, not my brother.
He looked me in the eyes for a long moment. I stared into bloodshot orbs filled with hatred of most humankind before he let out a roar of maniacal laughter. Tightening his grip, he lifted me off the ground in one mighty swoop and sent me flying through the upstairs bedroom window. Falling felt so surreal as the world seemed to reduce to slow motion. The second story pulled farther away as I closed in on the cold, hard earth. I landed with a crunching thud, all my bones shattering instantly. My eyes stared listlessly into the moon and stars, taking in the moment before pain destroyed me. Stray pieces of glass fell around me, plenty already wedged in my arms. A large shard jutted out of my ribcage. The last thing I heard were sirens in the distance and the sound of agonizing screaming ripping from my throat as my body collapsed into internal shutdown. The pale blonde head popped out of the broken window above me, waving at me tauntingly, with the same wild grin plastered on his face. I sobbed, salty tears and blood dripping down into my mouth. Closing my eyes, I welcomed my fate. The world sank away into the abyss, and I felt myself release into the safety of death. Birds chirped outside as I woke to sunlight shining through my bedroom window, the news playing quietly on the flat screen. Sitting up, I looked around my bedroom, remembering everything that had happened. The blue van, those psychotic twins, running me over, breaking into my house. The full-on war scene that transpired in the room I sat in now was perfectly laid out as if nothing had ever taken place. Being thrown out the window and dying, sprawled out in a bloody, broken mass on the lawn. Dread washed over me, and I felt nauseous. Nothing bad ever happened. Why was this happening now, and why the hell was it happening to me? Why do I remember these things, and how am I even still alive? After a strong cup of coffee and quiet contemplation, I called in sick to work. I wasn't lying. I felt sick in the head. That counts, right? Today was not going to be like every other day. Today, the game has changed. I will not be the helpless victim to whatever time loop hell those twin freaks have unwillingly roped me into. This is my house. It's my game now. Headlights filled the living room as the blue van crept into the driveway just after 10 p.m. The stuttering engine died and the lights vanished into the darkness. I stood in the entryway towards the back of the house, tucked into a corner and out of sight. I waited there, breathing shallow breaths. Somewhere outside, an owl hooted, and crickets made their presence known with their high-pitched chirps. Moonlight bled through the front door. After long moments of silence, the twin shadows appeared silhouetted within the glass frame. Click. It was time. Click. Go on. Open it. Click. Click. Smiling, I slinked further into my hiding place as the lock unhitched and the door creaked open. The twins stood there for some time, staring inside. They stepped into the home, closing the door behind them. Standing in the hallway, the house fell into dead silence. One twin moved with slow steps, and the floor creaked under his weight. The other followed, and the creaking continued as they ventured inside. They passed me and went to the dining room. Emerging from my hiding place, I trailed quietly behind them, tiptoeing along and matching their steps to avoid unnecessary creaking.
Where is she? I don't know. This isn't part of the plan. You suppose she remembers? Maybe another dose just for our report.
I tightened my grip on the baseball bat in my hands and prepared myself to deal out a dose of "get the fuck out of my house," with a side of "dead on my living room floor."
We could bring her to the lab for more testing if her memory did retain the events after going through the time shift.
Testing? Time shift? Who the hell are these people? That won't be necessary, I said, swinging the bat around, bashing the twins behind the head simultaneously, and watching them topple limply to the floor in a crumbled pile of flesh and bone. I stood there a moment, staring at their unmoving bodies, feeling sick to my stomach. Am I part of some weird government testing? without even knowing I'm a participant? Can that even happen? Is that legal? Nothing about this was legal in any way. Lost in thought, I didn't notice one of the twins stirring awake. Caught off guard, the man gripped my ankle and dragged me into a painful split, and I cried out in painful surprise. My ankle twisted and cracked under me, and I flopped to my side to release the pressure. He took hold of my shirt and climbed on top of my stomach, pinning me to the floor. The other twins stirred off to the side as he began to regain consciousness. Laughing maniacally, the twin sitting on me tightened a hand around my throat and clenched as hard as he could. I choked and gagged, flailing my legs. Why? I croaked, twisting and squirming to no avail.
Because it had to be you. Too complacent, unsuspecting, nice, naive, perfect,
he said, grinning ear to ear. He laughed again and leaned his hand close to my eyes, sticking 2 fingers out and motioning toward me. The fingers poked my eyes and I screamed, pulling away as best I could and flailing my legs. He persisted and poked deeper. I could hear his fingers squishing around, and I felt blood and God knows what else running down my cheeks. I screamed louder. Using all my energy, I lurched forward and smashed my forehead into his, sending him toppling backward off of me. Leaping to my feet, I ran upstairs, loud banging footsteps following behind me, and I rounded the corner of the upstairs hallway. Pulling the door to the attic down, I swiftly made my way up the ladder and waited in the corner behind the opening for Tweedledee and Tweedledum to follow. I wiped the back of my hand across my cheek. Looking down, my hand was covered in blood. The creak of wood sounded as the twins ascended to the attic. As they entered the attic space, I sparked a match and looked at it with a bittersweet smile. Looking down, I smiled at the gasoline I had poured all over the attic floor. Making eye contact with the twins, they stared at me in disbelief.
What are you doing?
One asked, taking a wary step forward, and I let out a wild, maniacal laugh. Winning! I dropped the match and jumped down the hold to the second story. The attic immediately erupted into flames, and I heard the twins screaming in fear. I pulled the ladder up and closed the attic door, knowing the fire had started in front of their only exit and was rapidly spreading to every crevice it could consume, including the twins. Stomping and screaming ensued above me as I calmly pulled out my cell phone and dialed 911.
911, what's your emergency?
I took a deep breath and said, "Hi, I would like to report a fire at 221 Maple Street. I was driving by just now and it looks like there's a fire starting in the attic. Better hurry before it spreads to the other townhouses." After wiping my face, I slipped my coat on and walked outside as the roof exploded in a roar of flames. I pulled out of the driveway as sirens began to sound in the distance, rapidly increasing in volume as they traveled closer to their destination. Pulling onto the main road, I drove through the evening in silence. I stopped when I was a good 200 miles away and pulled into a lone restaurant in the middle of nowhere just off the highway. Sitting at the bar, I ordered a cola and some French fries to go. As I waited for my road snack, the news came on with a still photo of a building engulfed by flames, with the headline, "Local house fire triggered by gas, 2 casualties." "Sir, would you mind turning up the TV? I'd like to know more about the fire." I looked at the waiter behind the counter, and he nodded.
Sure thing, little lady.
He turned the volume up, and the news reporter's voice became clear.
10:32 p.m. this evening. An anonymous tip called the local authorities and reported the house fire you can see burning here behind me right now. The fire department is having a grim time extinguishing the flames as they appear to have been triggered by gasoline spread across the attic. What's more concerning is there appear to be people trapped inside the attic. Upon arrival, the screams could be heard from down the street. However, As the flames spread, the firefighters could not reach those inside, and the screaming has since died down. Their safety is currently unknown as the fire department battles these massive flames. More to come as we report live on the scene. This is Rebecca Trulio with Channel 5 News. Be safe out there.
Here's your meal.
The waiter set my drink in front of me with a greasy brown paper bag. I thanked him and left the restaurant. Sitting in the car, I thought about everything that had transpired, about how I spent the last 20 years living the delusion that I was immune to experiencing those bizarre stories on the news. Now, here I am, driving into oblivion, unsure about everyone and everything in my life. I still don't know who those men were or any strange experiments they were involved in that I'm involved in. I don't even know if my memories are mine. Terrible. I can only hope that they are. I am not the same girl I was a few days ago. Experience has a funny way of doing that to people, changing them. This may be a blessing in disguise. I get to start over now. Find a new town far away from here. Create a new image. Be a new me. I'll find a home in a nice area, read my books and steep my tea. I'll go to work and do all the normal things normal people do. And nothing bad will ever happen.
Joseph Murek rocked back on his heels, pulling a sleeve of his thick cotton shirt over his nose. He stared at the ground, not making a sound. Oiling the gears, as his grandpa said. No amount of thought could bring him any resolution, however, 4 days in a row. By God, did it smell. The ground around Joseph's muddy boots was littered with corpses of birds. His dog, Hera, whined restlessly behind him, keeping her distance from the bird carcasses. This fact in itself alarmed him more than the event. Hera was fond of eating just about anything. Normally, a field full of easily accessible birds would have looked much akin to a free buffet. He sank to a knee, casting his eyes among the fallen animals. It was getting worse, whatever it was. It started 4 days ago when his wife Beth came sprinting toward the house at full speed. Rounding 60 years of age, this was a sight to behold. Her blue sundress billowed behind her, sending her rocking off balance as she ran. Long curly strands of graying black hair bounced along behind her as she kicked off her loose sandals, picking up speed. Joseph smiled. What a racket. She had been shrieking his name the whole way, skipping over twigs, tree roots, and other obstacles that separated her from their small, upstate New York cottage. Her shrill cries drew Joseph out of his armchair. As he neared the worn screen door, Beth rocketed by him, almost knocking him off balance and barely making it through the closing door. "The docks!" she screamed from inside the house. Joseph stepped outside, lingering on the threshold. Beth's face was white, even whiter than usual. Her chest heaved and her hair framing her face was matted with sweat. Joseph knitted his brow in confusion and turned toward their small boathouse. "They're everywhere! Filthy damn things!" she continued, wailing from the security of their kitchen. For someone so accustomed to the flora and fauna of their environment, she still turned into a terrified schoolgirl when faced with bugs. Joseph laughed then. It hadn't been funny in the end. The boathouse path Joseph dug out in his younger days began to show signs of disrepair, and to tell the truth, he simply didn't have the energy to maintain it anymore. He walked down the bumpy, root-snarled road, taking in a deep breath of moist air. Rain tonight, probably. He kept his pace slow but steady. At his doctor's behest, he was to take it easy. Very easy. After his second heart attack, he was a ticking time bomb. It was then that he noticed the quiet. No more than 10 steps ago, the low thrum of crickets and cicadas could be heard chattering through the woods. Now, nothing. He paused. He could see the lumpy silhouette of the partially repaired boathouse over the scrub brush. It was on the wrong side of a rotten tree last fall, and the insurance company was taking their sweet time. Besides the eerie quiet, everything seemed normal. He turned toward his destination and planted his right foot. The crunch that issued from underneath his boot traveled all the way up his body. He yanked his foot back, staggering to catch his balance. "Oh, Christ," he said. The ground was littered with insects, almost to the point of choking the path, and it only became worse as the trail neared the boathouse. Dread settled over him like a thick woolen coat. His bones ached, and he knew for damn sure he wasn't going any further. He turned on his heel and began walking back to the house, his pulse rising to alarming levels. There were thousands of them, all dead. He decided that a quicker pace in the return trip was worth the risk. He swung open the screen door to the house and pushed past Hera. Beth was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping a glass of what most assuredly was not water. She looked up as he entered. He could tell she was still on the verge of tears. "Did you see them?" she said. Her left leg jogged up and down nervously. "I saw them." Joseph crossed the yellowed linoleum of the kitchen floor, tugging off the cap Beth knitted for him years ago. His hair had all chosen to abandon ship before going gray. Maybe some kind of chemical got loose from a farm nearby, but I'm not positive. The sheer number of them was... He stuffed the cap into the pocket of a hanging coat near the door. "Fucked up?" Beth said. That sounds about right. Joseph nodded. It was fucked up, all right. I'm going to give Animal Control a call in the morning. Let's keep Hera in for the night. She'll stick with one of us until we figure this out. Beth nodded warily as she watched Joseph lock the front door for the first time in years. Neither slept well that evening. Now this. Shaken from his daydreaming by the pungent aroma, Joseph marveled once more at the sheer amount of death. The fallen birds ranged widely in everything from size to species. Joseph was no ornithologist, or even a bird watcher for that matter, but he knew damn well that entire clouds of birds didn't just drop from the sky. Hera whined at him again. He reached down and stroked the big dog behind her ears. "You're telling me." He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, suddenly feeling that they were no longer alone. "Let's get out of here, girl." He retreated from what felt like a crime scene, just as he did the past 3 days, his heart racing uncomfortably in his chest. The woods around their home grew still and quiet as the days slipped by. Beth often refused to come out of the house. After her encounter with the legions of dead insects, she found better ways to spend her time. Indoors. Weeds were already sprouting up in her once pristine garden, and Joseph rushed right by them on his way back to the house. Hera nosed her way in front of him, eager to get inside. "What is it now?" Beth called from across the house. She was engrossed in her knitting. That was good. "Honestly?" Joseph said. "Honestly." Birds. Joseph made his way through the small kitchen into the living room, approaching the phone. A whole hell of a lot of dead birds. The clicking of metal needles stopped. "Here we go." "You said you would call that man back if..." Her voice began to rise as she spoke. Calm down, calm down!" Joseph raised both of his hands, backing to the room slowly. "I'm calling him right now." He picked up the receiver and dug a scrap of paper out of his pocket. On it was scribbled the name and number of the local sheriff, not one of his favorite people. Nonetheless, the man offered up his personal contact information during their last meeting, just in case anything else strange happened. Beth calmed visibly and slumped back in her chair. The rhythmic click of knitting needles resumed. Joseph punched the number into the phone, and after 2 beats, a voice answered on the other side of the line. "Officer Coolin, it's Joseph." No response. "Murick, Joseph Murick, the guy with all the dead bugs." Joseph closed his eyes and massaged his forehead with his thumb and index finger. "Mr. Murick, I'm sorry. Always been bad with names. Won't forget tramping around ankle deep in bugs anytime soon, though. Is everything all right?" The younger man asked. "It's getting worse," Joseph said. "Went for a look today and the entire area has a fresh layer of dead birds." "Birds?" Coughlin's voice took on a tinge of worry. "How many are we talking?" "I don't know." Joseph lowered his voice, glancing at Beth. "Hundreds." "Shit," Coughlin said. "I'm on my way. I'll bring some of the animal boys to help clean up." "Thanks." Joseph hung up the receiver. He needed a drink. 2 hours later, Joseph stood in the woods once more. this time accompanied by 3 other men. The sheriff wore his standard officer's uniform and stood about a head shorter than Joseph. Dark sunglasses covered his eyes and sweat ran down his face from the hairline of his black buzz cut. The other 2 looked like a series of mugshots come to life. Big, tough, and ugly were a few descriptors that immediately came to mind. They wore grungy jeans. The larger of the 2 sported a black sleeveless shirt picturing a grinning skull. Charming. The 3 men carried an array of equipment ranging from shovels to strange elongated pieces of aluminum topped with metal hooks. Joseph was less than keen to discover just how they would be using those long silver rods. You weren't kidding. Officer Coughlin pinched his nose. Jesus, the smell! The 2 larger fellows didn't seem to mind the stench. Get to work, boys. Joseph and I need to talk. He motioned to Joseph to step away. Joseph followed the sheriff upwind, hoping for a respite from the smell. Anything this time? Coughlin said. Joseph shook his head. No, nothing that either of us noticed. It was the same way with the bugs and the... Joseph scrunched his nose. His eyes watered a bit. Fish? Coughlin finished for him. That was something special. He moved around Joseph, removing a small camera from the pocket of his pants. The small silver rectangle shimmered when struck by the odd ray of sunlight piercing the normal gloom. I'm going to take some photos again, and then I guess we'll get to work debirding your property. The small camera beeped and extended its lens. Joseph watched Coughlin move around the scene while taking a few careful photographs. He caught the 2 men from animal control and a few to offer perspective of the amount of dead birds in comparison to the large fellows. Oiling the gears. Joseph removed his hat and rubbed a rough hand over his scalp. It's moving up, isn't it? Joseph felt a chill. Coughlin stopped in his tracks, lowering the camera. Up what? Coughlin asked. The food chain. Joseph's heart jumped up a few notches. First bugs, then fish, and now birds. All of them around my boathouse. What the hell is going on here, Coughlin? Calm down, Joseph. Coughlin rested a hand on Joseph's shoulder, reaching up to compensate for height. His grip was firm, reassuring. For now, let's get this cleaned up. The faster we get this done, the easier you'll sleep tonight. Coughlin squeezed the older man's shoulder, then headed for the truck. It's some weird shit, that's for sure. Luckily for you, someone took an interest, especially after I reported in today. He reached into the truck's bed, retrieved a long pole, and handed it to Joseph. A crew from the city is coming to have a look at your boathouse and the surrounding area tomorrow afternoon, round 1. Joseph breathed a sigh of relief. Finally. He seized the metal rod from Coughlin and sneered. Let's go bag some birds. Tools in hand, the men set about spending their final afternoon together. Yep. Joseph speared a dead bird on the tip of his aluminum pole. I knew I wasn't going to like what these did. He hefted the bird over to a growing pile near Coughlin's truck and shook it loose. It landed with a damp, stomach-churning smack and tumbled down the growing mound of carcasses. Gonna take you all day if you keep bringing one in at a time, Graham Laurel, the larger of the animal control boys, muttered. He rested the tip of the pole he carried on the mound and slid 6 dead birds off of his hook with a bloody work boot. He was young, a bit of an asshole, and a full head taller than Joseph. He found something to moan about every few minutes once the conversations died down and the real work began. Would you like to join me and my wife for dinner sometime, Graham? Joseph said. I just can't get enough of that winning personality. Graham spat on the ground and walked back through his cleared path through the slain fowl. He leaned the pole on his shoulder and raised his left hand, lazily wagging his middle finger through the air. Mr. Laurel, how about a little respect for a taxpayer that makes sure you see a paycheck? Sheriff Coughlin said he passed the goon. Graham spat again, dropped his middle finger, and stomped further into the woods. Coughlin approached the truck. He shrugged. He's not a bad kid. Little bit of a temper and complains more than my grandmother, but not a bad kid. Now, the other one, Dwayne. He's a piece of work. I'm sure, Joseph said. He'd already dismissed the exchange, his mind mulling over the situation at hand. In fact, he would still be thinking about what tomorrow would bring, when Graham met the owl. Graham Laurel was pissed. He had forgotten to put sunscreen on his head. A bald patch had already begun to show among his tightly cut blonde hair and was now most certainly a bright, angry red. He poked the top of his sweat-slicked scalp and cringed. Just fucking perfect. "Hotter than shit," Graham said. He turned toward the old man's boathouse, combing the ground with his eyes. "Damn dead birds everywhere." He spotted a crow laying on the ground, undamaged beside the parade of ants crawling out of its eye sockets. He grimaced. Sick. He took a step back and hefted his aluminum pole. He jabbed the sharpened point into the bird and lifted it into the air. Ants rained down briefly as he swung the dead bird further away from him, and then he saw it. The owl. It occurred to him that he never saw an owl before. He never really cared about it. Until now. It sat up on a branch directly ahead of him, its pale face turned toward Graham. Large, yellow, unblinking eyes greeted his. What the hell is an owl doing out in the daylight? The owl ruffled its wings and turned its head. Graham had to stifle a shriek. The sudden move caught him off guard. The bird took a few careful steps to the left on the branch, almost like it was trying to see around Graham. "Can I help you, man?" Graham called up at the bird. Its lidless eyes returned to him. The white and brown plumage covered its body didn't seem to move at all. "Hey!" Graham waved his hands. The owl did not flinch. What the fuck? Graham dropped the aluminum pole with a metallic thump and scanned the ground for an object. Bingo. A large pine cone lay nearby, one side coated in dried mud. He hefted it in his right hand. He looked around, scanning for the old man and that damned sheriff. The coast was clear. The owl continued to stare. Graham could feel it looking into him. "Cut it out, man!" Graham, a natural-born pitcher with long, sinewy arms, squinted, aiming at the bird. His arm cocked back, then released like it was spring-loaded. The pine cone spun through the air, right on target. "Oh shit, I really hummed that." The pine cone bounced off of the small bird unfazed, but obviously injured. A chunk of feathers had been torn out of its chest by the projectile. Small dots of blood began to peek above the skin. Regardless, it continued to stare. Graham took a step backwards. "What the?" The owl moved again, its gaze returning to Graham's left. It wobbled on the branch, attempting to right itself drunkenly. "The hell are you staring at?" Graham shouted. But the lifeless form of the owl pitching to the ground stopped him. He froze in place. Something was wrong. He turned to his left slowly. His skin felt cold. He didn't see anything in the dwindling afternoon light. But something saw him. He felt a strange sensation and then burning hooks dug into his mind. He tried to scream, but realized that he was physically unable. His body was locked in place, along with his eyes, frozen in the direction he and his old friend the owl had been looking. As panic set in, he felt the burning barbs recede a little. Young and strong Graham. Graham. Graham tried to scream again. Nothing. What the fuck was that? The pain increased in his head. A bonfire smoldered behind his eyes. The agony slowly faded to a dull hum, but it never lost its unflinching hold. Still too strong, perhaps. Joseph's dog barked in the distance. The pain increased again, this time exponentially. Images flashed through his mind unbidden until he couldn't help but think of Lassie. He felt his lips curl into an uncomfortable grin. "What is the name for this creature, Graham?" "Dog. It's a dog. Let me go, please. God, please don't kill me." "I am sorry. Yes, sorry, Graham. I was not ready. You would have been spared pain." Graham shrieked inside his own mind with such force that the paralyzing barbs receded for a moment. Graham's mouth flopped open. "Dog!" Graham stated loudly. Sheriff Coughlin crunched through the foliage, snapping twigs with his heavy leather boots. The sun was going down and light was running low. Dwayne already stowed the gear and claimed a shotgun for the ride back. They decided to call it quits for the day. but no one had heard from or seen Graham for over an hour. He was sure he had went this way. Hera barked somewhere behind him. "Dog!" The voice of Graham boomed out from ahead. The sheriff, not liking the deadpan tone to the young man's voice, sprinted in Graham's direction. Who the hell was he talking to? That voice was Graham, all right, but wrong. He crashed through the undergrowth and came to a skidding stop at the prone form of Graham, twitching madly on the ground. White foam began to press between his tightly clenched teeth. His eyes rolled in their sockets like loose marbles. Coughlin dropped to his knees, unfastening his leather belt, pulling it out from around his waist with a snap. "Don't choke on your tongue, you bastard." He pried the youth's mouth open and released his jaws once the belt was between them. After a few seconds, the seizing stopped. Graham was whiter than a sheet. His breath came in short, whispery gasps. "Graham, what happened?" He pulled the belt slowly out of Graham's mouth, letting it drop to the ground. Graham opened his mouth slowly. At first, only a wet, choking sound came out. The dog, it... He took a deep, shuddering breath. "It wants the dog now." Blood began to run freely from his nostrils. He shook uncontrollably. Before long, the body Sheriff Coughlin held lay still. The small breaths faded. "Graham!" He shook the boy. "Jesus, what happened?" In front of him, something moved, yet the movement left no trace. His heart jumped into his throat. I couldn't even see it. What the fuck is going on? Leaves drifted to the ground where the disturbance occurred. The dog. The sheriff dropped the body of Graham Laurel and bolted to his feet. "Joseph, get away from the dog!" he called out. Joseph massaged his left shoulder. It always started to ache toward the evening. The area looked considerably better than it had. Most of the visible birds were cleared away by the small crew. He did not envy whoever had to tie up the giant plastic sack of dead animals, however. Not even the Laurel boy. Hera barked behind him. He started, cursing out loud. "The hell's wrong with you?" Joseph turned toward the dog. "You scared the shit out of me." "Mind keeping a lid on the mutt?" Dwayne Laurel growled from inside the truck. He had his dirty boots propped up on the dash while Coughlin wasn't around. Joseph decided against responding. His recent chats with Dwayne were unpleasant at best. Hera whined strangely and backed away from the truck, her tail tucked between her legs. Her tongue hung loosely out of her mouth. Her breath came in loud, jagged gasps. A growl ripped through the air. Joseph watched in horror as the dog that never so much as playfully nipped at someone turned into a frightened, murderous animal. Hera. What's wrong? Joseph backed away from the truck and the snarling dog. He turned quickly toward the woods. He could have sworn he heard someone call his name. Hera growled low in her throat. Strings of saliva hung from her jaws. She looked as though she was about to leap upon some unseen predator. When she froze in place, the horrible snarl etched itself onto her face. Her eyes blank and glassy. Her heaving abdomen was all but completely still. As far as he could tell, she wasn't breathing at all. "The hell's up with your dog, man?" Dwayne sat up, opening the door slightly. The sound of the wheezing sheriff crashed out of the woods. Hera regarded him indifferently. "Joseph!" Sheriff Coughlin inched his right hand toward the small leather strap holding a service pistol in place. "Get back to the house!" "My dog," Joseph protested. "Shoot the fucking thing, Sheriff, it's rabid!" Dwayne pulled the door of the truck closed again. The locks clicked from within. "Graham's dead!" The leather strap snapped loose with a click. Last thing he said was, "It wants the dog." He pulled the pistol, leveling it at Hera. Joseph took a startled step forward. "Whoa, whoa, whoa! You can't just shoot my dog, man!" Coughlin took a step towards Hera, his gun still raised. "I don't know what's going on here anymore." Panic clawed at the edge of the sheriff's voice. "All I know is that a dying boy very clearly told me something wanted your dog. So, yes, I'm sure as shit about to shoot your dog." He squinted. His finger tightened on the trigger of the pistol. Hera collapsed to the ground. Coughlin lowered his pistol, stunned. "Hera!" Joseph jogged around the truck. His chest hurt something awful. Coughlin wiped sweat out of his eyes. I don't think I did anything in time. Joseph examined his dog. The 5-year-old German Shepherd was dead. Aside from a small amount of blood seeping from her nose and ears, she looked completely unharmed. The sound of car doors unlocking caused him to jerk his head up. Shit. He had forgotten about Dwayne. Dead? The car door creaked open. Dwayne unwound his 6-foot frame and stepped outside. Graham is fucking dead? His brown eyes bulged with terror. No way! I'm not fucking dying here! Dwayne sprinted up the road away from the Murick house. Stop! The voice of Graham Laurel dragged itself from the form of the prone dog. Holy shit. Coughlin raised his pistol. Joseph fell, madly scooting away from Harris' corpse. Dwayne, stop! Graham shouted through Harris' still mouth. Dwayne stopped on the road ahead and turned around. Get away from the dog, Joseph. Coughlin thumbed the safety of his pistol off. Joseph scrambled to the other side of the truck, his heart racing. Graham? Dwayne took a few uneasy steps back towards the truck. Don't listen, Dwayne! Coughlin shouted from the truck. Dwayne ignored the sheriff and took a few more steps back toward the group. Harris' jaws stretched into a horrific grin. Oh shit, Dwayne, get back! Coughlin fired 3 rounds into the dog. Blood and fur arched through the air. Up the road, Dwayne froze mid-step, his jaw sagging open lazily. Get back to your house, Joseph. Coughlin still had his gun drawn, and he walked toward the driver's seat of the van. Go inside. I'm calling in more units. Something is fucked here. Joseph obeyed the good sheriff, who died mid-step, a heartbeat, after completing that same sentence. Something watched Sheriff Coughlin move toward the front of his truck. The enveloping, tenebrous intelligence that Graham and Dwayne Laurel encountered had grown strong. Clawing up from animals, it was ready for its intended prey. The air shifted around Dwayne. A breeze ruffled Coughlin's hair. He froze mid-stride. Finally, you make sense. Everything that made Coughlin more than just a biological organism was destroyed instantly. With a great, invisible devouring, it consumed the sheriff. It reveled in its conquest, savoring. The man that was Coughlin stared blankly into space, his jaw hanging open. Joseph raised his hands over his head, carefully breathing in 3-second intervals, something he had been taught to slow down the old ticker. 1, 2, 3. He let his breath escape. 1, 2, 3. He was almost to the house. He would just throw all the locks closed on the doors and sit down. He wheezed up the small incline leading to the back door, pausing to take a few more breaths at the door. 1, 2. His gaze pivoted back to the truck. The sheriff was nowhere to be seen. The police truck remained unperturbed. Its driver's side door never opened. Backup never called for. His breathing rhythm fell to pieces. He sucked air in with sharp, jagged hitches. He felt cold. A tingle began to spread from the center of his chest, radiating outwards. Oh shit, oh shit, oh shit. He forced his jagged breathing to a halt, pulling in another deep gasp of air. He had to get inside. He turned, extending his right arm and throwing the screen door open. It clattered off the side of the house, swinging shut with a slow whine. Joseph scrambled to the back door, locking it behind him and flipping all of the porch lights on. He heard Beth stand up in the living room, approaching with slow, uneven steps. She must have been asleep. All finished? Beth rubbed at her eyes, ending the sentence with an unceremonious yawn while pulling off her old bulky headphones. She didn't hear. Beth, Joseph said. 1, 2, 3. Lock the front door. Fuck it, lock all the windows too. Joseph, you're scaring me. She was fully awake now. What happened? Just, please go lock up. He approached his wife, squeezing her shoulders gently. I'll tell you after I call the station. Wait, we need to let Hera in. Beth moved to push past her husband. He didn't move. Elizabeth, don't, Joseph said. His wife looked up at him. If something's out there, then we need her. Her voice raised to her no longer messing around tone. Hera is dead, Beth, Joseph said. Beth whimpered. Her shoulders slumped. Just, please, go lock up. I'll explain after I call the station. She nodded, tear-brimmed eyes blinking rapidly. Beth looked ready to burst with questions, but Joseph's stern gaze squelched any further interrogation. She set about sliding old locks into place and drawing the curtains shut across the various windows. Joseph shakily approached the old wall-mounted plastic phone, willing himself to calm down. He snagged the receiver and punched in 911. Nothing. He hung the phone up, then lifted it to his ear again. Nothing. No fucking dial tone. He slammed the phone into its cradle. Joseph pressed the heels of his palms into his eyes and rubbed. Brilliant colors ran across his vision. He felt clammy, sick. Beth was finished with her errand, entering the living room at a rapid pace. Joseph, Beth whispered. She walked slowly, sticking to the most interior wall of the house as if monstrous hands would burst through any window or door and yank her through. What's happening? Joseph approached the back door. He slid the curtain obscuring his view of the police truck aside, except there was no police truck now. He closed his eyes slowly. That's impossible. He breathed and opened his eyes. No truck. Not so much as tire depressions in the long grass of his backyard. Nothing at all. Joseph? Beth squeaked. Remember the argument we got into about whether or not we should own a gun? Joseph turned back to his wife. Yeah? Why? Go get the gun. You're about to be glad I want that one, Joseph said. Beth puffed up to the second story of their house. They built the place back in the 70s, and Joseph wasn't what you called handy. Stairs creaked, and exposed nails hid around the most innocent of corners, ready to snag an elbow or rip a brand new shirt. She paused, stepping awkwardly over the second to highest step. It was loose. Joseph promised to fix it about 2 months ago. She paused when she made it to the second floor. It was getting dark quickly, and the shadow-filled hallway stretching around the corner filled her with a nameless sense of dread. She flicked on lights as she proceeded toward the master bedroom and the small closet that held the shotgun. She darted into Joseph's office, turning on the primary lamp as she went. The locks on these windows had a layer of paint over them, so she used a metal paperweight to pound them closed. Once done, she left the office. She turned left at the end of the hallway and pushed open the door to the master bedroom. It was always dark in here. She instinctively groped to the right, grasping the 3 switches that controlled the lights to their room. She flipped them all on, but the room remained shrouded in the gloomy darkness. She could see far enough inside to locate the closet. The hallway light still worked, but something much more than a bad feeling began to inch itself into her mind. She thought about turning and calling down to Joseph, but stopped. Don't be a child. She took a cautious step into the master bedroom. See, not so bad. She made her way around their king-sized bed. She navigated this room hundreds of times in the dark. She reached the far wall, feeling for the door of the closet. Cold metal brushed against her hand. She seized the knob and paused. She didn't want to open it. In fact, she never wanted to avoid something so badly. She released the knob. She had to decide fast. The darkness was scaring her. Fucking fuck it. The sound of her curses gave her the boost to grasp the knob and twist, opening the closet. She cringed, but nothing bound out of the darkness to rip her limb from limb. She smiled to herself and entered. Let's find this gun and get back downstairs. She flipped the light switch in the closet out of habit. The bulb bloomed to life, and then shattered, sending a rain of glass and filament down onto the closet floor.
Oh, God!
Beth covered her head with her hands. Tiny bits of debris bounced off her skin and nestled into her hair. Her heart hammered in her chest. She blindly groped for the shotgun. It rested at its normal spot, propped up against the back right corner. She seized it and sprinted out of the dark bedroom, aching for the comforting light of the hallway. Joseph could hear his wife scurrying back toward the stairs from below. He left his post by the back door and moved toward the stairway. Eventually, she arrived at the top of the stairwell, clutching the dusty old shotgun. Joseph took 2 long strides up the stairs and extended a hand. Beth tossed him the gun. "Thanks, honey," Joseph said.
What's happening? The power in our room didn't work. Everything else was all right, though.
Beth shook her head.
Think a fuse?
No, not a fuse. Joseph turned and, taking the stairs 2 at a time, headed for the kitchen. Crossing to the pantry, he began rummaging for the unopened box of shotgun shells. Something is out there. I'm not sure what. Joseph pushed aside a few boxes of oatmeal. Gotta watch that cholesterol. He snapped the heavy box out of one of the darker corners of the pantry, plopped it on the table, and set about clumsily loading the firearm.
Something? Like an animal? Oh, God, did those poor boys get attacked by something?
Beth's eyes widened with panic, already glassing over with tears. No, not an animal, Joseph said. A shell slipped out of his grip and skittered across the floor. He paid it no mind. Well, it could be, I suppose. I haven't seen it, so I don't really know what to tell you. The final shell clicked into place. He felt a surge of courage. All I know is that we're staying inside until it's light. Nothing gets opened until morning.
Why don't we just call someone?
Beth made for the phone but was stopped by the way Joseph looked at her.
No phone?
Joseph shook his head. He watched her entire frame begin to tremble ever so slightly. He let the shotgun lean against a nearby cabinet and massaged the left side of his chest in slow circles with his right hand. Beth was on the move before he could stop her. She returned with a small orange plastic bottle containing his medication. Joseph smiled gratefully, accepting the small bottle, letting his fingers linger over hers for a few seconds. Joseph trundled to the refrigerator, pulling it open with a soothing swoosh. The cold air against his face felt nice. He grabbed a bottle of water, snapped it open, and popped a few of the minuscule pills into his mouth. Some of the anxiety burning low in the back of his head began to fade. The medicine always helped. The Murick family sat down at their kitchen table, a loaded shotgun on display instead of a home-cooked meal, and waited. Beth sprawled across the table, her hair covered her face, puffing out in a slow rhythm to match her breathing. Joseph yawned. His eyes felt itchy. He scrunched his face and rotated his neck, issuing a loud series of cracks. Beth mumbled something across the table but remained asleep. The oven's display glowed in the background. Only 3 in the morning. It was still pitch black outside and completely silent. Nothing disturbed them since the disappearance of the sheriff, and that set him on edge. Joseph stood up as quietly as he could in a creaky old house and took the shotgun from the table. He crept, quiet footstep by footstep, until he was face to face with the small, eye-level window above the back door. His left hand shook as he began to draw back the blinds, not sure what he was even looking for, but nothing greeted him. The porch lights hummed pleasantly, bathing their porch in a yellowish light. All evidence of the truck and its crew vanished, something that still troubled him deeply. Maybe it was over. Maybe whatever came to the area had lost interest in an old man and his wife. Just maybe.
No, Joseph, I'm still here.
Joseph stifled a scream. The voice came from just outside of the back door. It sounded wrong. He could understand what was being said, but the words sounded robotic, like someone who just learned French struggling with their first restaurant order.
Not without kindness, Joseph.
Hair stood on the back of his neck. His hands quaked. Beth remained asleep at this table. Something told him this conversation was private.
You will have your night. What is left of it. I am
It paused.
Murderer, yes, murderer. I have learned. I have felt what your microscopic kind call an excuse for feelings, for emotions. The strange accent began to fade. The voice became clearer, louder. It became human. I have felt your needless fear, your struggle, the voice of Sheriff Coughlin said through the thin wooden door. But do not be afraid. The voice lowered, becoming quiet. Soon you'll join us, Graham Laurel cried out joyfully. Joseph staggered away from the door, the shotgun bouncing wildly as he attempted to steady his aim at the door. The doorway was quiet now. The sound of feet leaving the area of the back door was absent. Complete silence. Once more. Joseph? Beth picked her head up, pushing her hair out of her face. Joseph lowered the shotgun and put on his best fake smile. His wife rubbed her eyes. What time is it? Only about 3-ish. He glanced at the back door. Still a ways to go yet, I'm afraid. He walked back to the kitchen table, extending a hand to his wife. Things have been quiet. Why don't we go get more comfortable? He smiled. She smiled back. Oh, if you really think it's safe. Beth stood up and accompanied her husband upstairs. They left the hall lights on. Beth became nervous when they rounded the corner to a completely lit master bedroom. She'd left the switches on during her excursion for the gun. Maybe it was just the old house after all. Joseph shrugged. He crossed to his side of the bed and sat down. More than anything, he longed to sleep. What about that thing? Beth sat down next to him, resting her head on his shoulder. That animal or whatever it was. I think it got bored. How about we just relax for a while? Joseph threw his right arm over Beth's shoulder, pulling her in close. They sat this way for a while, both tired, but happy to be together. Only one knowing that this night would most likely be their last. Sleep wasn't much of an option, so they sat together, talking through the long hours of the night while the rest of the township around them slept. They talked about their upcoming trip across country to bask in the Pacific sun. They talked about their children, long ago grown and moved off to start their own lives. All three of them more than proving their ability to handle the wild world outside of their parents' door. Joseph struggled to keep composure. As time dragged on, he became more and more terrified. He had to remain calm for Beth. Soon, conversation began to wane and Beth's eyelids grew heavy. She would fall asleep for a few short seconds, then wake back up with a start. Joseph smiled and pulled back the sheets on the bed. Wordlessly, Beth slid into them, fluffing her pillows, the very picture of comfort. In no time at all, she fell blissfully asleep. Joseph lay next to her, his right hand still entwined with hers. He craned his neck around the sleeping form of his wife. The bright blue display of the clock caused his heart to sink. 5 a.m. How much longer would they have? He slid out of the bed. 35 years of marriage armed him with the ability to disengage from any of Beth's encompassing embraces undetected. Before leaving, he leaned over his wife and planted a kiss on her forehead. She stirred slightly as if unconsciously acknowledging it. Joseph took a deep breath and walked across the room to the door. He glanced behind him and smiled. Nothing will touch her. Not as long as I'm here. He hefted the weight of the shotgun onto his shoulder and walked toward his study. He pushed the door open and grinned. He kicked off his shoes, letting his sore feet enjoy the plush carpet. The air was musky with the scent of years of cigar smoke. Joseph took up the habit a while back, much to Beth's displeasure. He avoided his desk. The plush leather armchair seemed much more enticing. He recalled hours of smoky viewings of SportsCenter, drinks shared with good friends, many of whom had moved far away enough to drift into obscurity. He flipped open the lid of the lacquered brown box resting on the small side table. He produced a cigar and a lighter from within. There would be no opening of windows this time, no hiding, just pure enjoyment. He bit into the cigar and clicked open the silver lighter. His thumb flicked the ignition once, but no flame. He huffed. The lighter clicked again as he attempted another light. Nothing. Motherfucker, Joseph growled through his mostly closed mouth. He flicked the lighter again and the small TV in his office lit up. Static roared through the room. White light blinded him momentarily. The cigar fell from his mouth. Where's the damn remote? He scrambled out of his chair, slapping at the buttons lining the side of the TV. Eventually, the noise ceased. His ears rung. "Yeah, tough guy?" Joseph looked around the room, waiting for his assailant. Nothing followed but silence. He crossed the room, returning to his chair. He snatched the cigar and lighter from their spots on the floor. He clicked the lighter open. This time, a bright red flame danced merrily after the first strike. He moved the lighter closer, puffing the cigar to life. Thick, oily fumes soon filled the room. He closed his eyes and allowed himself a moment of rest. "Joseph!" Joseph's eyes shot open and he grabbed the shotgun. Nothing in the room moved. He was alone. Cold fear began to press its way up his spine. He stood up from the chair, breathing as calmly as he could. He pushed open the door with the barrel of his gun and peeked out. He walked the hallway and peered around the corner to see Beth dozing in the room down the hall. Aside from that, nothing out of the ordinary. He returned to his office, still examining the hallway. "Joseph!" The voice spoke from directly behind him. He cried out and jumped back into the hall, spinning and firing the shotgun. The blast shook him from head to toe. The shot tore the computer on his desk apart. The only casualty in the room was his 5-year-old PC. "Son of a bitch!" He clutched the left side of his chest. He glanced again at the master bedroom. The door was shut. No, no, no! He ran to the door, frantically turning the knob in both hands. Locked. He pounded his fists on the door. "Beth! Wake up!" No noise issued from inside of the room. He spun to face the empty hallway. "Don't you touch her!" He yelled into the morning air. The only reply was the faint sound of glass breaking from downstairs. Gooseflesh sprang up across both his arms. He pulled the gun up, ejecting the spent shell from the chamber. The stairs were empty, as far as he could tell. More glass breaking from downstairs, followed by what he could only describe as a strange grunt. Joseph pressed his back against the far wall of the stairs and proceeded toward the back door, gun held at shoulder height. He reached the bottom of the stairs and looked through the kitchen. The screen door lay on the ground, ripped from the hinges. The back door hung open. The white eyelet drapes dangling from the windows were streaked with the blood. Glass littered the floor. Something, or someone else was inside the house. But whatever he was dealing with did not seem to be troubled by barriers, physical or otherwise. Sheriff Coughlin barreled into Joseph from behind, sending the older man sprawling across the floor. He was half convinced that he would blow his own head off when he landed on the shotgun. The two men tumbled to the ground. The shotgun came loose from Joseph's grip and clattered across the floor, coming to rest near the wall by the back door. "Interesting," Sheriff Coughlin spoke in the same strange voice he heard throughout the evening. "Such specimens you are." The sheriff shoved Joseph off of him and stood. Joseph crawled toward the shotgun only to feel the hands of the stout man close around his right foot. His hand squeaked across the wooden floor as Coughlin dragged him into the kitchen. The sheriff moved strangely, like a man who spent far too much time on a boat than dry land. Joseph kicked out with his left leg, striking Coughlin just behind his right knee. He staggered and fell, losing his grip on Joseph's wriggling foot. Clumsy, however. Coughlin quickly regained his balance. Joseph shrieked and backed toward the door. Small fragments of glass shredded his palms. Bloody handprints marked his traversal across the floor. Sheriff Coughlin towered menacingly over him. His eyes rolled up to their whites and opened wide. Far too wide. Bulging blood vessels ran over the milky white surface of those eyes. His mouth hung open in a mask of terror. His open jaw twisted in a horrible, muted scream that allowed the strange voice to pour out. This one did not like you. Coughlin took a wobbly step toward Joseph. Crazy old bastard. Coughlin's own voice escaped from his paralyzed mouth. Another step. This one steadier. Joseph shook himself free of his terror. The shotgun. Where is... Coughlin darted forward and pulled Joseph up from the floor by the collar of his shirt. Joseph cried out and struck Coughlin a heavy blow to the temple with his right hand. Coughlin's grip remained strong. So much hate in all of you. This is what you all want, below all of your niceties and manners. Coughlin released his right hand and dealt Joseph a thundering blow to the side of his head. Color exploded behind Joseph's eyes. He sagged momentarily, unable to reorient himself. I've learned everything about you that I could possibly ever need to make my choice. He struck Joseph again, this time a backhand across the other side of his face. Joseph grunted. Blood seeped from between his lips. His nose hurt like hell. Joseph rocked his hand back and pitched forward, slamming his forehead into those terrifying eyes. A satisfying crunch answered. The Coughlin thing released its grip and stumbled backwards. Joseph dropped to the ground and snatched the gun, leveling it at Coughlin. What the fuck are you? Joseph felt like he was going to faint, but held his ground. I am the first of many. The Envoy. Coughlin gargled what may have been a laugh. Are you? Joseph had so many questions, but Coughlin interrupted his line of thought. I'm with your wife now. The voice was cold. Joseph fired. Coughlin crumpled backwards, his torso shredded by the close proximity of the blast. His corpse crashed into the kitchen table, knocking aside chairs and smashing loose plates. All the same, all so violent, it said through Coughlin's still mouth. Joseph paid the being no heed and stormed up the stairs. His chest began to throb alarmingly before his confrontation with the good sheriff. Now, it was full-blown spasm of agony arching through his left arm. So be it. If he was going to die, at least his own body would do the job. The door to the master bedroom was now wide open. The room was silent. The large window, which was no longer covered by curtains, showed the sun peeking over the horizon. Joseph entered the room. Beth. Oh, God. His left hand rose to cover his mouth. Beth was sitting bolt upright in bed. Her eyes stared out the window. Tears streamed down her cheeks. A strange smell permeated the air. Joseph knew he should be able to identify it, but was unable until he pulled the sheets back. Urine stained Beth's clothes and the bed underneath her. Shit. Oh, shit, Beth. Joseph crawled onto the bed. He let the shotgun drop from his grip. What did it matter? He gripped his wife by her arms. Beth, he asked, his voice quiet with worry. She turned her head slightly, drifting from the window to her husband. Her green eyes met with his and locked there. Joseph. A horrifyingly wide smile ripped across her face. She looked more like the Cheshire Cat than his wife. Her hand shot up, grabbing the side of his head. They felt like vices. Fingernails dug into the flesh of his scalp, drawing blood. Beth, you're hurting me! Joseph attempted to struggle, but she was so much stronger. Joseph, just look. It can all be over. She began to wrench her husband's head toward the window. He struggled briefly, fighting her until the pain in his chest was too much to bear. He let go. His head turned towards the window. He just wants to learn. Beth whispered into his ear. Outside, something shifted in the brightening dawn.
Chilling tales for dark nights.